We're launched.
Good morning. We'll be starting up here in about a little over 2.5 minutes. As you're logging in, we added some of the forms we talked about last week and a couple of other items to the handout we're using. So if you want to download a new version, the link is both on the screen and also in the chat pod. Main thing that's different, if you downloaded last week's, is the last 5 or 6 pages or some forms from the Local Projects Manual that you may want to find. And we're going to go through some of them during the course of today and a little bit next week. As you're logging in, we'll be starting up now in a little over a minute. So good morning and welcome to day 2 for our Construction Contract Administration for Local Federal Aid Workshop. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here at the New York State LTAP Center of the Cornell Local Roads Program. And cold temperatures have come back for a few days. In fact, they're even calling for some snow later this week. So I hope everybody had a good week. Um, and hopefully we'll finish where we started from. We're going to cover some of that. We did add some pages to the handout, and so you may want to download the handout again. Main thing is we added some forms. We had mentioned them last week, but we added a few forms to the back side of the handout. The link is in the chat pod. You don't have to type it. Just open the chat pod up at the bottom. And again, we're going to be using Poll Everywhere at the website that you see there on the screen. And by the magic of miracles here, I don't have to touch anything. It's going to show up in the chat pod, poll.ev.com/DavidOrPE. And that way, if you don't have the app, you can just go to the website. Now, day 2. We'll get started here and get going with day 2. As a reminder for those who don't do this very often, the chat pod is disabled for you to put in information into the chat. We use that mostly to send information out to you, such as links to the handout and Poll Everywhere and things like that. But you may want to open that up. We are going to ask folks to raise their hands now and then to answer questions. And then the Q&A is actually where you can put in your information. We'll definitely be using that quite a bit along with Poll Everywhere. And so just to make sure everybody's on the same page, if everybody could go down the bottom right, raise your hand. We'll just see how many people are awake this morning. Good, Good to see, and looks like y'all are in good shape. Okay, glad to see it. And now Amanda's going to lower your hands, and we'll get moving on here. So we're into day two. We last week talked about getting started and doing federal projects. Covered a little bit of the pre-construction issues. We're going to go through some of those things a little bit. Today is mainly on the contract administration documentation, a lot of the compliance issues dealing with federal aid. Next week, we're going to finish up with construction monitoring and closeout. We're going to do a Q&A with a panel. I'll go through the panel in a second. And then we're going to finish the whole workshop with a Jeopardy game. So I actually need 4 people who are willing to be participants in our Jeopardy game next week. You can either just, if you put it into the Q&A that you're interested, willing to participate, or you can just send us an email at clrp@cornell.edu, and we'd be glad to add you. And we need 4 participants to play Jeopardy. We have not figured out the prize yet, but everybody will be able to play along. It's actually sort of fun. The panel for next week, we currently have 3 folks from the Department of Transportation, 2 with the Local Programs Bureau, and a person from the Office of Diversity and Opportunity to answer questions at the New York State DOT side, and then 5 individuals with the division office here in New York State with Federal Highway Administration, ranging from the Local Programs Manager, Tricia Millington, all the way down to Chris Millington, Major Project Structural Engineer. So now the agenda for today, the first hour, we're going to finish up some stuff on contract administration and documentation and review day 1. We'll take a 15-minute break. We'll do federal and state provisions for the next 2 hours, taking a break in the middle because we know that the mind can absorb what the can endure. Okay, so let's get ourselves started here. Let's look at what we talked about last week, just as a reminder. We're not going to get into heavy detail, but we'll talk a little bit about the overview of the federal process, the roles and responsibilities, and we finished up with the pre-construction issues. And just as a reminder, we talked about it here in New York State, outside of New York City, about 650 projects over a 4-year span, so a little over 160, involving 247 local agencies. So a lot of agencies do many projects, and a lot do just a few. So the goal here is to help everybody out. We talked about the overall project process and the scoping issues that come into play, everything from planning and operations and maintenance. And the whole concept to remind ourselves is the process can be fairly complicated, but we can break it down into simple components and then make sure we understand each one, and we should be in pretty good shape. And we may need to loop back. I don't show all the arrows on here. You may need to loop back even during scoping, all the way back to the planning process, just to keep that in mind. And a good way to think about this is just imagine, rather than a project for a bridge or a safety project, we're looking at dinner. What do you have to do? Well, you have to plan dinner. You have to scope and make sure you've got all the things you need. You then design what you're going to make. You actually make the dinner, and then you got to clean everything up. A little bit of O&M, getting ready for the next meal coming down the pike. My mom always said the hardest part for dinner for her was figuring out what to eat. If she could help with the planning and scoping, she didn't mind the cooking, and she loved to cook. Okay, so you can think about that same process when it comes to projects, and especially with federal aid. It's really probably good that you do all the steps for a project before you actually apply for the grant. One of the things we don't want people to do is apply for a grant and then have the problems. That's usually where you get into trouble. Okay. We talked a lot about roles and responsibilities last week, and if you've ever made cinnamon rolls, the idea is you put the roles together and they actually help everybody rise up a little further. So that center one has really risen up a lot, and that's true here. We all have a role to play, and if we do it well, we help each other out. And there's definitely lots of different agencies involved. There's the Federal Highway Administration and other federal agencies. There's New York State DOT, and then there's the sponsor. And of course, the sponsor, as we all know, is really just the local agency. Okay, so if you hear the word sponsor or see it in the documents, in this case, we're talking local agency. Okay. We talked a little bit about the project manager and bringing that project manager into focus, who that person is going to be. Realize somebody for the local agency, the sponsor, has to be a full time employee in responsible charge of the project. Generally, that's the project manager. There are some other ways and roles, but the real thing to remember is you need somebody full time who is overseeing the process. And this probably is not the elected official because they're generally not full time employees. They need to be a full time employee, 40 hours or 39 or whatever the full time is for your agency. And then we started with the administration of construction contracts, the introduction, a bit on project management, and some of the pre construction activities. Now, we ended with questions that y'all sent in. I'll answer some of the ones y'all typed in at the end of last week's session, but you're welcome to type in some additional questions now, and I'm going to give you two opportunities today to type additional questions for the panel for next week, and even ones we can maybe answer today. So you please feel free to type in some questions, but I'm going to go over a few of them and to show you some of the ones that we're going to be sending to the panel for next week. And I'll give them a heads up that they're coming so they're ready to get them answered. Okay, so the first question that came up, somebody asked, can we get the presentation in an email, the slide deck? No, we don't typically post a slide deck. That's when we have the handout. A couple of reasons for that, not the least of which is a lot of the slides don't have that much on them. We want you to be able to follow along later on. And there's a lot of references and resources that really that's what you need to be using in the future. That's when we give you the handout. Plus, there's also a lot of the pictures in here. I can show them. I can't send them to you. I would have to pull them all out under fair use rules. So we don't send out the slide deck, but there is a handout. And if you have any questions on any of the resources, we can help you get access to them. Does the project manager need to be licensed? So in the Q&A pod, what does somebody think? Do you think the project manager needs to be licensed, as in a licensed engineer? What do you think? I got to know. Absolutely. The project manager does not need to be a licensed engineer. Now, you probably need an engineer somewhere in the project. That might be the EIC. It might be the consulting engineer. If there's a need under education law for engineering, you'll have to have a licensed engineer in there, but that does not need to be the project manager. Should the project manager be a consultant or sponsor based? What do you think? Someone asked that. Should the PM be consultant or sponsor based? Everybody's saying sponsor, some are saying either. The key is you can use a consultant to be the project manager. Okay? That's fine. But and here's the key, you have to have a full-time employee of the agency who is in responsible charge. So if their title might be different, but it's easiest just make the project manager a full-time employee and working for the sponsor. If you want to hire a consultant to be the engineer in charge or the resident engineer on the job site, you can have them do a lot of the management, but the person in responsible charge has to be a full-time employee. Okay? That's an easy enough thing to remember. Okay? What are some recommendations for local agencies to go about scoping projects? Now, this is one we're going to send to the panel because I think it's a really important one to get their feedback from the state and federal folks. But in the Q&A, what do you think? What would you say on this? And while you're giving me some answers, I'm going to type in the link for the poll everywhere because somebody asked about it. Of course, it would help if I put the slashes in the correct direction. Okay, so here's some of the answers y'all typed in while I was putting in the poll everywhere link. Go talk to your metropolitan planning organization, your MPO. Yeah, that's a great idea. You definitely want to talk to various people. Don't just talk to one agency. That's a really good idea. Figure out what you want to do and where you want to do it. Talk to the regional DOT. The RLPL is a great contact even before you get started. You're going to want to do some public hearings. You're going to want to review data such as crash data. Absolutely. One of the things I always recommend to anybody for any project, and that's when we did the dinner exercise last week, put that whole project from start to finish on paper. It could be on a whiteboard, on a chalkboard, on a bunch of post it notes. Walk the whole thing through. We actually do that for workshops like this. We build a storyboard up around it. We go the whole project through, throw a whole bunch of stuff together, rebuild it. We essentially try to build the workshop before we go out. Same thing with this. Build the whole project on paper, not just in your head, before you go and get the grant. And there's lots of resources available to help you with scoping. Okay? Who provides technical assistance? Who do you think you need to talk to about who's going to help you with technical assistance, both before, during, and even after a project? Where can you go to get help? Federal Highway Administration, New York State Materials Group. Yep, they've got lots of people to help you. The Regional Local Project Liaison. Absolutely. And if you're not sure, that's one of the reasons that you should know your RLPL is they can help you find the right people, whether it's the division engineer, area engineer, or it's other folks. You can, of course, contact us. We can help you find folks. But almost all of these agencies have a responsibility for technical assistance. In fact, that's one of the primary roles for the Federal Highway Administration is to help with technical assistance. Now, normally that's through the DOT, but in many cases, there may be a time when you need to have direct contact with someone from Federal Highway. Talk to your LPL and you'll get some help. Now, I have other questions, but I want to make sure we get to everything else. We're going to send these to the panel. We may come back to these. We'll see if time allows. We may come back to some of these questions, but we're going to ask questions about how can you assist the resident engineer? This is the sponsor's resident engineer in resolving issues beyond their control. How many projects can you manage at once? That's a really important question if you've got more than one. How much responsibility can you put into a consultant PM or a consultant EIC? Okay. How to moderate between consultants and contractors. We're actually going to talk about some of these a little bit today as well, but these are important. What are some suggestions to monitor scope creep? A major issue with a lot of projects. What are eligible funds? We're going to talk about ineligible funds some today, but that's a very important question. How do we ensure sufficient project funding? What changes can be made to plans after the PS&E transmittal memo is submitted? In other words, you've got a final design. What changes can you make? We're going to talk about change orders today, but that's actually a really important question. So I want to make sure the panel gives the chance to answer it. And when do you use engineering judgment versus public input? And so these are great questions. There's actually about a dozen more that I've got. I just want to give you a flavor of some of the kinds of questions. A lot of them we're going to answer today, but I'll throw them out the panel and we'll get their answers back in the second hour next week. So there's a poll everywhere that's available. It's now up on screen. You can add to it. Okay. So what I want you to do is keep putting in some questions. We're going to compile these. We'll type them in. Okay. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to type in a few more if you've got questions that have come up. Don't worry, even if we cover it today, I want to make sure we get your questions. So go ahead and put in new ones. Give you a minute. And at the very end of the workshop today, before we end, I'll give you another chance to put in more questions to make sure we've gotten any questions you've got to the panel. Okay? And so some of these we can't necessarily answer today, but we'll put in your questions and we'll go from there. Okay? If my mouse will. There we go. There's some more ones. So things such as, can you ask for additional funds if bid prices come in high? Some of these questions I think you probably know, but please ask them. And you're going to have help from other folks. Okay? And again, I'll come back to that and give everybody a chance to start up again. Okay? And yes, if you can't get to the poll everywhere, if you put the question into the Q&A, we will include that in the list. So I know some people don't necessarily have access. That happened last week as well. So please put them in the Q&A. We, we will make sure those questions get asked, but we'll make them anonymous. We don't care who asks. Now, we talked last week a little bit about QA/QC. Again, you could do a whole class on QA/QC. It doesn't stand for quit asking, quit checking. A good way to think about this uh, is think of quality control as being the contractor, the C for contractor, and quality assurance being the A for the agency. Um, so quality of the contractor is quality control. These are things that they're doing to address their own operations, sampling, testing, field testing, things like that. And quality assurance would be that work of the agency. Uh, this is some verification. Normally it's done independently of the work being done by the contractor. There are some ways to use some random sampling and other testing of the contractor's work, but it has to be done in an independent way. Okay? You can't do the things together. That's not really kosher. Okay? And I like the questions that are coming in here. Again, we'll save all these questions and we'll get back to some of them today if we have time, and we'll put them to the panel if we don't. Okay? In terms of quality assurance program requirements, this comes from Chapter 15. Probably the single most important activity is it needs to be independent. You have to provide independent assurance. They actually use another acronym, IA. You'll see that in a few spots, to ensure that the work is being done independently. Okay? So you have to develop a program of testing to make sure that there's been compliance. And you hear that word a lot too. So why is that important that we have that independent assurance? Why do you think that's actually a pretty key component to a quality assurance program? Why do you think that's really important? So we can put that in the Q&A and see what they think. Why is it so important to have that independence? Avoid conflict of interest, non-biased answers. It's also very important to, settle disputes is a good reason for it. Honest results. It's also to make sure that there's no chance that something was missed. Having an outside person coming in, an independent assurance, is really good to make sure that you don't miss something, because it can happen very, very easily. We're inside the project, we don't even see these things going on. So it's really nice to have someone checking it who their only stake in the game is getting the testing done, and actually improves the quality of the whole project. Okay? They may never find anything. I mean, there are states doing steel testing for rebar that have never had a failure, but just having a good program in place ensures the quality, because people know there's a good quality, simple to follow program. So keep that in mind. We talked about it helps you with the dispute resolution. Yeah, that's a good answer. Okay. To do all of this, you do need some laboratory accreditation and qualification, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit more detail. Okay, that's pretty important. Uh, you want to have good QA/QC within the program itself. Okay. You need to make sure the people involved are qualified personnel. Okay. That's a critical activity. Okay. The agency has to provide some acceptance, i.e. the local sponsor. Okay. And that's really the goal here. All of these things are done, and then whoever's doing the project has to provide some acceptance, some assurance. Obviously, if the state were doing the project, it would be the state DOT providing the acceptance to Federal Highway. In this case, it's a local agency through the Local Projects Manual. Okay. Now, if it's on the National Highway System, there's a little bit more detail that has to be followed. Okay. You have to follow certain procedures for quality assurance. Okay. If it's not on the national highway system, you can use alternate state procedures if they meet the federal requirements. But man, why not just follow the state requirements with some exceptions we'll talk about? It's a lot easier. Everybody knows what they are. It's easier to follow. Okay. Now, in terms of agency acceptance programs, you use only your own acceptance data. Okay. It's pretty important. Okay. And has to include, you can include validated contractors. I said that earlier. Okay. That's pretty done very often where you take data from the quality control of the contractor and you include it in your testing. Why do you think that's actually okay? I mean, we talked about independence, but why would it be okay to actually use data from the contractor? Why would that be okay? And what do I have to ensure if I'm going to use their data? Why is that actually okay? And actually, it can actually be a good thing. Why would I want to use data from the contractor? It was originally under inspection. It collaborates with your independent data. Okay. Yep. The key here is, yeah, they can't dispute their own data. That's a really good point. They've collected the data, they provide it. And if there's a conflict, they can't go, our data is no good. I know they have to pretty much accept their own if they've supplied it to you. It's also, if you check it statistically, and we won't get into the statistics, it's really good because it verifies two different testing schema, quality control and quality assurance, came up with the same answer. That's a win-win. Okay, there's a lot of good reasons to do that, but you have to have some processes in place. We're not going to get into a lot of that right now. That's just not what we just don't have time for that. But what I want to do, our first poll EV, other than the questions, is who is qualified to do quality assurance? You're going to go hire somebody to do testing, or the state might. We'll talk about that a little bit. Who is qualified? What what kind of people would you put into here that would be qualified personnel for quality assurance? Laboratory, yes, but what about the laboratory people? What makes them? They're certified. Yep. Okay. Certified. NYSET. You see NYSET there. That's a really important one. NYSET is a very critical acronym. Could be a licensed engineers, certified technicians. Okay. You may want a PE. Sometimes you actually may actually want the NYSET people. Okay. ACI testing, very good. If you're not sure of who is officially listed as certified and can meet the qualifications, guess what? It's in chapter 15 and then a couple of other spots throughout the local projects manual. You don't have to remember all of these things. Okay, so let's see who else we got on the list here. I've come up here. And there's my mouse. Oops. Gotta make sure I get my arrow here working. There we go. Based on requirements of accepting agency, maintenance responsible charge. Yep. Again, the states laid that out. You don't have to remember all of that. ACI, NYSET, Alfred State has a bunch of people doing asphalt testing that are qualified. There's another one, NETTCP, and no, I don't remember what the acronym stands for. I have to look it up. But the whole point is you can look all these things up. You don't have to memorize them. Okay? There is a National Laboratory Accreditation Bureau. They have a great acronym. They're accrediting laboratories, and their initials are LAB. Okay? You want to make sure they've got good quality work. There's also a Construction Materials Engineering Council. And again, these are all in the projects manual. You don't have to remember any of them. If you're not sure, you can always pick up the phone and talk to the RLPL and ask, are these people qualified? And they can help you find that out. No reason to try to reinvent the wheel. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about dispute resolution. We're going to come back to that. It's a pretty important thing. Inside your quality control, quality assurance, you need to have procedures in place for dispute resolution. What happens when there's a conflict? And this is required if you're using the contractor's quality control results. Okay? You have to have what happens if. If you say the strength of the concrete is 3,200 and the contractor says it's 3,800 and you have a dispute, you have to have a procedure in place to make sure that you solve the dispute. So, how do you think we can solve that problem? You think the concrete's below the standard of, say, 3,500, and the contractor says it's above the standard. And the data they gave you says that. So, what do you do now? What do you think you're going to do now to solve the dispute other than putting on the gloves and letting you duke it out? Talk to the RLPL. You might have to retest. Here's the key though, retesting is probably going to be something you need to do, but who does the testing? It's not done by the contractor, and it really shouldn't even be done by the agency or the person the agency has hired immediately. You need to have a third party laboratory. You need to bring somebody in, and that should be defined in your plan so that everybody knows up front. If there's a dispute, we're going to go to this company to do the testing and give us the result. And they're independent. So you get an independent accredited third party laboratory. Okay. Again, it all comes back to this idea of the independent assurance. Unbiased, independent. Okay. Easy way to remember it. If you're not sure, is it somebody both parties can agree is doing the testing without bias towards one side or the other. Okay. They're not directly responsible for the agency side. They're not directly responsible for the contractor side. They're doing independent work. Okay. So it's pretty important to keep that in mind for independent insurance. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about change orders and time extensions. We talked about that briefly last week. I bring it up now as the ending of our discussion about last week because change orders can get us into trouble. And we need to make sure we understand it. And that goes back to one of the questions you raised with scoping. So we got to keep that in mind. Scoping is critical. And what did I say was the most important thing last week? And I still think it's the single most important issue when it comes to good project management and good local projects, or actually good state projects. Very good. Somebody got it already. There we go. Good. Communication. Yeah. We need to communicate, communicate, communicate. Okay. Absolutely vital as much as anything. So that means picking up the phone, talking to the RLPL. The RLPL will pick up the phone, talk to the area engineer. Communication. Okay. A simple phone call when you start to see a problem can go a long ways to solving the problem. But we all know the real world isn't nice and neat. Everybody would love to be able to just do certain things and everything works perfectly. It doesn't happen. So let's communicate the problems. That is still the most common problem of all the things we've been sent. It's a failure of communication. And then one last thing I want to remind folks of, I hope we'll talk more about these today. I hope we never see one in your projects, and that's a FAIN, another acronym, a federal aid ineligibility notice. What that essentially says is you're not going to get paid. Now, it may be for the whole project, very rare. It might be for part of the project, some materials, some aspect. We don't want to see a FAIN for anything. Okay. One of the things you can also leads to is not just withholding payment for this, but make you ineligible for future projects until you've resolved the FAIN and the existing project. So you really want to not get to those. And the goal here really is to never have one. And so there's a lot more details in the local projects manual. We'll talk about this more later today. And as I said last week, and we'll say again, and might be a category in jeopardy, there's lots of acronyms you got to deal with. And generally, if you can start to know all those acronyms, you're probably getting to the point where you start to understand the process pretty well. Okay? So keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, we're going to start with today's stuff. Really, this was actually a review of a lot of things we talked a lot about last week, plus a few more details on QA/QC. Let's talk now about construction administration and documentation. It's one major heading in the entire chapter, and yet it's going to take us a large part of the rest of the day to cover because it's got a lot of details with some compliance issues. I will be referencing other parts of the LPM, so keep that in mind as we talk about this today. And we're going to go through the chapter in order. So if you haven't downloaded chapter 15, you may want to think about doing that. We're going to try to go through pretty much in the same order as the chapter has it, so you can make notes as you go along. If you need to download it later, you can do so. But the whole idea was this is the document you're going to be using later. We'll go through it in that order. So we're going to start with progress payments. When my computer wakes up, there we go. Uh, you know, progress payments are pretty important. There's payments for the contractor, the subcontractor, and there's payments to you as a local agency. So how often do you think we get project payments? How often are you asking for money from the state as a local sponsor? hmm Yep, generally monthly. Okay. So about every month you ask for some funds. Okay. Now, can you set up a different payment system? You could, but as we'll talk, you probably don't want to do that. And we'll talk about why when we get to progress payments, especially for subcontractors. Okay. Now, the work that's performed that you can get paid for, what's included in the work that's performed? What can you get paid for? What do you get paid for in the Q&A? You could get paid for design, construction, planning. Yep, it's amazing how many things are actually eligible for federal aid. Almost anything related to a project is eligible. Okay, that goes back to scoping in some respects, but that's okay. You can get paid for almost anything. Your progress payments are for work you've actually performed. Okay, so if you've done something, that can include materials you've collected, stockpiled that you haven't actually put onto the job site. Okay. Now, there's some requirements around that. Okay. Unincorporated materials is a term sometimes I see in the Q&A pod used for stockpiled materials, but it's something you've spent money on is a good way to think about it. If you spent money on it, you can probably get reimbursed with some exceptions. Okay. Now, the estimate for this is done by the engineer in charge or the resident engineer, again, depending on your title structure you develop in your construction management plan. Okay. And it's an estimate. It will be audited later on, possibly, so really should be really more detailed than just a general estimate. It should be pretty accurate. Can't be super accurate with stockpiled materials sometimes if they're divisible, but that's okay. So the engineer prepares this. It includes the value of the work, the materials that are in place, ready to go, and those that are stockpiled. Okay. And of course, this could be things that are stored on sites, but it has to be secured. It can't be inventory that can walk. So don't count that. Don't count stuff that you've ordered, but it isn't actually there yet. Make sure that it's been stockpiled. Okay. And go from that. And there are some controls in place um, in terms of if you've ordered something from a construction yard. Okay. Maybe some structural steel that's sitting in the fabrication yard. You can even count that, but you got to have a document chain. That's really the big key is can you show that this product is going to show up on the job site? If you can't, don't include it. Okay. So here's what happens in terms of the way reimbursement works. It's really a pretty simple process. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the contractor performs the work. There is a time when the contractor may be the local agency. When would the local agency actually be the first step in this process? What part of the project involves the local agency, i.e. the sponsor, performing the work? Planning, scoping, and possibly design if they do it in-house. Yeah, anything you're doing yourself. You got to document these things. You perform the work and you go ask for reimbursement. And it's the same process all the way up through. So let's talk about the construction phase because that's the process we're talking about for this workshop is the construction phase. But the contractor performs the work. The sponsor pays the contractor after getting a request for reimbursement. Okay. Then the state reimburses the sponsor after getting a request for reimbursement. And Federal Highway Administration reimburses the DOT after getting a request from the state DOT, step by step by step by step. Okay? Back and forth, back and forth. So, as a local agency, you're actually getting paid by New York State DOT via vouchers system. New York State gets paid via something called FEMAS. Okay? And again, I always have to look up FEMAS. Okay? But the F stands for federal. Okay? The whole thing to remember is each agency gets paid in step. So one of the reasons that I think the state likes to get monthly request is because they're more likely to be able to get their money from the feds. So here's an example, a question in the Q&A. And again, I want your questions as we go along. Even if I put them into the queue to ask the panel, I'd rather have them as we go along. Is there an instance where sponsor performed maintenance could be qualified for local aid? Yes, actually, it could be. It depends on the grant. It depends on the process. It depends on the project. The answer is maintenance can be included in a federal aid project if it's in the scope of that particular federal aid process. Okay. So there have been maintenance projects that are eligible for federal aid if they're on the national highway system, for instance, if it can show improving the longevity. You're going to have to include that in the scoping and a plan. And something that's maintenance based probably needs to include multiple structures. You may need to do some project bundling. There's actually an everyday counts initiative from Federal Highway on project bundling. In fact, if you look, we will be putting out some notices and some webinars coming up on that. But it depends on the scope. You got to look at the grant that's been put out or the notice that's been put out. Okay. Now, in terms of the reimbursement request, okay, some things always have to be on there. One is called the PIN, okay, the project information number or PIN. There has to be an active PIN. Every single project is assigned a PIN number. Our contracts we have with USDOT and New York State DOT have active PIN numbers. That has to be included, and it has to be an active PIN. That's pretty important. You can't get paid for a project that's been closed out. Okay? And you're going to have other things, as some people have already put in. You'll have to have your D number and your region number. You'll have to include eligible work. Okay? We'll talk a lot more about what is eligible and what's not, but that is pretty important. You'll have to show proof of payment. Okay? You got to make sure you've actually been paid, and someone needs to be able to audit and go back and make sure that's done. And of course, there's some federal reporting requirements. We'll talk a lot about those. That includes, have you met the equal employment opportunity kinds of things, EEO or DBE? Okay. A lot of this goes back to the original agreement that's been set up. A lot of it, you might have to look in other parts of the local projects manual, such Chapter 5, for instance. Chapter 5 has a whole bunch on what's eligible and forms that are available. There's always a form. I can guarantee you, if you're not sure, there's a form. There is a form to use to fill out for making this work. Okay? And yes, there's some civil rights requirements that are involved in all of this as well. We'll talk more about this. But the key is to make sure. Okay? Now, Dave McEwen put in there, and this is something that's important. We're actually dealing with that right now. New York State is switching over to the state financial system. We're just now doing training ourselves, so I don't have a lot of details on this, but it's going to go into electronic reimbursement request. It's going to be all electronic. The paper is going to go away. That's good. But there will be some changes in the requirements. The state financial system, more uniform. It may be different than the past a little bit, but the requirements aren't going to change much because there's still federal requirements behind all of them. So if you're not sure, ask questions. And we've already seen evidence with our request that the state's actually pretty flexible. They're not going, oop, nope, nope. They're saying, no, it doesn't quite meet it. Let's fix it. Fix it. Okay. Work out the first few times till we get all the paperwork right. And once you've done it a few times, then it becomes just a matter of doing it again. Now, once in a while, the feds come along and they do a review. Um, you'll get some long, gory detail. And the only reason I'm showing you this is to indicate there's a full depth. They really do look at a lot of things. Do not try to read this, please. In fact, I'm going to go on and get rid of this as soon as my computer says so. The whole idea is there's a lot of detail on these things. Okay? And way to remember it is they burn everything up. No, it's called a FIRE, a Financial Integrity Review and Evaluation. This is essentially a review whether or not everything's being done properly. Okay? And so the depth can be pretty detailed. Don't try not to lose any sleep over this. If you've done a good job of managing things, yeah, they may find some minor thing. You'll just need to fix it and move on. This is not going to lead to a fine. You're not going to lose your money. This is just a review. They have to do a certain number per year. And they're just making sure that we're following efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance. Just remember those three words. And FHW is always looking at those three words. Okay. We'll come back to FIRE one more time later on. Okay. Now, in terms of the reimbursement request, we've already said they need to be timely. Okay. The minimum you can do is every 6 months. You cannot do more than that. Okay. You can do less than that. Again, normally monthly is the most common, but you have to do at least every 6 months. Quarterly is also okay. Don't ask for $5. Try to ask for 500 or more. So if you've got a project that's inactive and not moving, you may want to talk to your RLPL, who can then talk to Federal Highway. If you've got a project that's stalled, you don't want to have the project shut down on you. You don't want that project to become inactive. So if you've got a project that's been stalled for some reason, again, pick up the phone, look at the time extensions, and we'll talk more about that. But that does happen where people fail to monitor a project that's stalled, and FHWA doesn't know. So they think the project somehow is inactive. You don't want that to happen. Okay. Make sure that you're following compliance. And that's what we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, talking about compliance. So I want to make sure we're on the same page there. Okay. The goal here is make sure that things are still eligible, make sure things are moving forward, and you should be fine. Okay. And again, if you're not sure, pick up the phone. Now, I'm going to talk about the construction phase. We could spend quite a bit of time on the next slide that I'm going to show you, but just keep in mind, construction is dangerous. Okay. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about construction safety. Okay. What that really means is making sure everyone on the job site is ready to be on the job site and be there safely so we can walk home every single day. Much in the same way that I go for a walk most mornings. When I go for the walk, I dress for the conditions. When it was -0 and there was snow, I need to be dressed for it. The right boots, the right overalls, the right hat, poles for snow, whatever I needed. And of course, with COVID, my mask. You need to be safe and everybody needs to be safe. Now, is there anybody mandated that has to be trained before the job starts? Is there anybody that has to have safety training before they go into the job site? Mandated. Again, we put this in the Q&A. Let's see. OSHA 10. Yeah. OSHA 10 is required. Technically, it's not 100%. Someone said everyone. Technically, it's for laborers, workers, and mechanics. Okay? Put everybody through it. If you're going on a federal aid project, put yourself as the sponsor. You may not technically need to be involved, but it's really good if you know what's involved with the OSHA 10-hour training. So make sure everybody's involved. Okay? Essentially, anybody who's working with a contractor really should be involved. And if you're inside the New York City rules, they're going to have some requirements as well. Okay? You may have your own specific. And we'll talk about that again. If a local agency has a more strict rule, that has to be followed. Okay? So if a local agency has additional training required, that actually needs to be followed, even though it's a federal aid project. You have to follow the strictest set of rules. Okay? But please make sure everybody's safe. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about construction inspection now. Those inspectors are out there. Okay? They're looking at the project, they're making sure everything's been done properly. I's are dotted, T's are crossed, things like that. Who is overall responsible to make sure the inspection is done? What what person from the sponsor is responsible? The RE, okay? The project manager, the EIC. There's lots of titles we could use, but whoever is the person in responsible charge. And so almost all the time when you hear someone from Federal Highway or DOT talk about it, they're talking about the project manager. There are ways technically to do it different, but just keep it in your mind. Just call it the project manager. Eventually that person has to sign off on it anyway. Okay, so yeah, the project manager is the one who's responsible overall for construction inspection for the sponsor. Okay. Yes, it could be the EIC, but generally the project manager signs off that the EIC is doing the job. So there needs to be someone in the field. Okay. Field inspectors. Who do the field inspectors work for? Can they work for a contractor or can they be in-house? Is there some restriction on who you've got for field inspectors? And if you're not sure, they could be both. Where do you list which way you're going to do field inspection? You remember what we talked about last week? What do I need to include? Where do I put the field inspectors? They must be paid by the sponsor. Yeah. Ah, there we go. Good. CMP. Initials today, construction management plan. How you're going to do that is in the construction management plan. Easy way to remember it. Again, we planned the whole process out. So if you want to do it with in-house people, you put it in the construction management plan. It happens. It's okay. You're going along, you realize I don't have enough inspectors, or I got other things I got to send these people to go do. I want to switch to a contractor doing the inspection. Is that okay? Raise your hand if you think it's okay to go from in-house inspectors to contracted inspectors in the middle of a project. Raise your hand. Yeah, I agree. Everybody's raising your hand. Good. I'm also keeping you awake. But what do you have to do when you make the switch from your own people doing inspection to hiring a contractor? What do you have to do? You have to update the CMP. So pick up the phone, talk to the RLPL and say, hey, we're going to switch. We need to change, and here's why. You got good reasons. They're not going to say no, but you got to change it because if you want to get reimbursed, you got to have it in the CMP. Okay. So you're going to have to change it. You're going to have to revise it. And there's a process. We talked about that last week for updating and modifying the CMP. Okay. You've got to follow the New York State standard specifications. Okay. So it's one of the items we talked about last week, documents you need to know and have in your list. That's definitely one of them, the standard specifications and any associated documents. You need to make sure that you've got your strop drawings included in the process. Who's doing the approvals for any structural work is something that has to be figured out. Okay. Absolutely critical. Making sure it's certified. Now, in chapter 15, there's a table. Okay. You don't have to look these things up and memorize them. There is a table that tells you the minimum inspection staffing that you have to have available depending on the project size. And remember, the project size is based upon the amount that you started with, the award amount. Okay. But you can always add some extra inspectors if there's justifiable reason. You just have to get approval ahead of time to do so. Now, of course, if you're looking at this table and you've got a relatively small project, and most local projects are probably going to fall into the smaller projects here. And by the way, if you're wondering, the full table goes up to $1 billion if you really want to know. But how in the world am I going to get one half of a staff person? It says here a nice at level 3. We will talk about level 3 here in just a minute. Okay. How in the world do I do a half a person? Yeah, could be a part timer. It could be a full time employee for your agency, but you've assigned them half time to be the inspector on this particular job. Okay. Or you can hire a contractor and you're paying that equivalent. So that's all they're talking about. It's not that you're hiring somebody only part time. It could be a full time person, but you're assigning them to the job half time. Okay. These are minimums. And there are ways to talk with, again, part of the construction management plan to say, well, I'd like to use one higher level NYSET person to do their other roles. But part of the reason they want these split out is to have two sets of eyes, have different people looking at things. It's good to have multiple eyes looking on there because you never know what kind of little things you might miss if you don't have a separate set of eyes looking for things. Okay. And it's really important to look for the details. Now, there are 4 NYSET technician levels in the table. Okay, there's the student level. These are essentially people who are still learning. They're just getting started in their career. Okay, beginning level stuff. Okay, what kind of things do you think a student level person could do? What kind of things do you think a student level person could be doing? Paperwork? Yeah, possibly. Okay. Counting inventory. Actually, in some respects, pardon me, basic observations. Absolutely. That's the kind of thing I would actually have them doing. I might not have them doing paperwork. I might have them helping with paperwork, but basic counting, basic observations. If they were out on a paving job, for instance, they might be collecting the tickets and making some initial notes, and then someone else checks the math. Okay. They might be out there measuring depths of the asphalt thickness, things like that. Basic stuff. Okay. Gathering tickets. Yeah. Level 2, that's an associate engineering. Okay. These are people that do more technical work. They're under direct supervision of the higher level technicians or an engineer. What kind of work do you think that level person is doing? Associate. What kind of work are they doing? They're doing a little more detailed field inspection, a little more independent. They may actually be preparing the initial daily work information that then gets reviewed by someone higher up. Okay. Yep. Okay. And then level 3 is an engineering level. These are people who are independent. They're doing the final daily work in a lot of cases. Okay. Um, but again, they still have somebody over them, either the EIC or a senior level engineering NICET person. Okay. And then finally, of course, the last person in the NICET train is a senior engineering level. They're doing some pretty complex stuff. And on some small projects, okay, you'll notice they're the highest level person. Okay. Even on some pretty good sized projects. You may not even need a level 4 person in some cases. One thing to think about is who's going to sign off on things. Okay. If you're not sure, better to have somebody a little bit higher up to make sure you've got the right level of inspection complexity and that you catch all the little details. And I'm hoping somebody caught this. Somebody noticed the small thing that should have been changed on the slide. See if anybody. Somebody caught it. Okay, good. Now be honest. Did I have to point it out to you? Yeah, probably. That's the reason we want inspectors. Little things can make a huge difference. We're not trying to be a pain. You don't want someone who's just too hyper about it. But the goal is catch the important things. If it's minor, talk to somebody. But if it's important, you need that independent person looking for it. And a little thing like that, probably in this case, isn't a big deal. We all know the difference between a Roman numeral 1 and an Arabic 1. But those are the kind of things where good inspection, working with the contractor and the sponsor, but yet being independent, can be very, very helpful. Okay. Okay, so construction inspection, there are some differences if you're on the national highway system or a state highway. Okay. So how do I know if I'm on the national highway system or a state highway? An official state highway, not just a touring route. It's got a number. How do I know I'm actually on one of those two? Because there are differences in what you have to do. The DOT's GIS, the MPO might have it. Check the right-of-way maps, possibly. There is actually a state has some online maps that are available for functional classification, okay, that will actually tell you that. And if I'm not sure, I can always pick up the phone and talk to my friendly RLPL. Can help me find it. Um, but of course, you probably want to have done that way back in scoping, maybe even the planning process. Because when you're on the state highway or the national highway system, got some good news for you. The DOT will help you with the inspection. Okay. Now, how much they're doing depends on the project size and complexity, but they might actually be doing daily inspection. They might only just do it once for the project, depending on the project. But a complex project, they may have signed somebody full time. Versus if it's off system, NYSDOT may or may not be providing inspection. Okay. So, what kind of work would the state still do for inspection? What kind of things does NYSDOT still do, even if it's off system? Let's see if we got some examples. ADA, probably not actually, but let's keep going. They may check it, but that's not the inspection. We're talking about the inspection during the construction phase. Materials at the plant, some bridge work, maybe some shop inspections. Here's the key to think about it. The DOT will do the inspection if they're already doing it because of their own operations, like an asphalt plant or a concrete plant you're buying from a state approved plant and they're there anyway, or they can do it without additional cost. By the way, a lot of times there's an overlap. But if they're going to be doing work nearby or they're going to be doing some other inspection that's at an additional cost, you can get them to do it. But if, for instance, you're buying concrete and it's not the state's not using that concrete plant, they might not have an inspector out there. So you need to have somebody doing the inspection. So keep that in mind. And again, work as part of the construction management plan. Get that in early. And the most important reason to get it in early, in my mind, is if you get it into the plan, it's eligible for federal reimbursement. You can get paid for it, but of course, it has to be part of the amount of money you're asking for from FHWA and the state DOT. But it is eligible. Okay, so keep that in mind. And in the Q&A, really good point. Don't shortchange yourself. Okay, you put it. Ask for the money. People go, oh, I don't have enough money. Money is not usually the problem. Time is. So ask for that funds. Get it in there. Get reimbursed. Don't just eat the cost. Okay, but it has to be in the construction management plan. The contract administration. There's certain things to think about. One thing to remember with contract administration, Under federal aid rules, construction is low bid. There's no warranty work in the federal aid process, with a couple of very minor exceptions, which we'll talk about. Okay. Now, there's a debate about that. We could talk about debates and stuff like that. At the moment, just keep it in mind. Construction is low bid. If that changes, it'll change in Chapter 15, or you'll be notified, or we'll let you know. Right? It happens. But on federal aid, its construction is low bid, which makes inspection and quality absolutely key. Okay? Now, if you want specific details, forms, procedures, check in the state specifications, the MERC, the Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. The key is we got to have good documentation, and we got to have really good records management. That inspection is really comes back to make sure you've gotten what you paid for. Okay. You got to coordinate the work, and the inspectors can help with that quite a bit if you've got good inspectors. Okay. Now, we're going to be taking our first break uh, because, again, the minds that can absorb what the can endure. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about construction inspection reports. Okay. So we'll go ahead and take our first break here. Let me make sure I write down the right slide number here. Okay. And yep, there we go. So we're going to start back up. I'll actually give you a couple of extra minutes since we're starting a little bit late. So we'll start back up at 9:48, and I'll change the clock. 9:48. See you in 15 minutes. We'll be starting up here in about, a minute or so. Actually, just under a minute. Okay, we're going to start back up now. Hope everybody's logged in. We're going to talk about construction and inspection reports and records. Okay, make sure we're on the same page here. And yes, two things that have come up in the Q&A. One is people have asked about the chat. Chat is disabled. We do ask you open it. We'll be putting messages into the audience via chat, but it is disabled coming in the other direction. The way you need to put in your answers and any of your questions is via the chat pod. You can also put in some answers on that first question Q&A poll. We'll track those as well. It should still be active. I'm not sure. Sometimes it doesn't keep it active, but we'll give you another opportunity for those who are not sure. So let's talk about construction and inspection reports. Uh, the purpose of inspection, really, more than anything else, is really just to make sure we document things. Uh, please be sure to provide some evidence. You need paperwork because it's a basis for acceptance of work. You know, if you think about it, at the end of the day, how do we know the work was done? Well, we do that via the inspection process. The inspectors essentially document that the work was done. And so they document the field conditions, what the contractor did, and in some cases, really even the project management by the sponsor. So really it's a listing of what's been done, and it's what's used to confirm what gets paid for. Now, the state does have an oversight role that they play. It's a pretty important role to make sure things are being done properly, and that's critical to look for oddities, things like that, to make sure that the process has been followed in the federal aid process. You'll all remember those three words that the feds listed we talked about last week, and that drives what they do. What are those three words? So you can get the three words in the Q&A. Efficient. Efficient is one. Effective and compliance. Okay, so you think about it from that standpoint. That's what the state's looking for. Okay, and so when the inspection is done, New York State DOT also does some inspection, either by coming out to the site or for reviewing things, providing insurance to FHWA that says clearly you can see through any fog the structure was built and it was built according to spec. Okay? It was built according to federal requirements. Now, the state, the RLPL, isn't going to be out there on day to day inspection. Okay? They're providing guidance and oversight to the sponsor. Okay? Their goal is to review the materials that are provided to make sure that by following those, we can assure to the FHWA things were being done properly. Okay? If you want them out there to look at something, pick up the phone and talk to them. Most RLPLs would be glad to help out. Now, the job of the inspector, whether that's FHWA and NYSDOT or the people that are paid for by the sponsor, they're going to document what's actually been done, the conditions on the site. What criterion are being followed? The plans, okay? What should have been done? Why or why not something hasn't been done? And then the effect of any of those problems, okay? So let's just talk about that a little bit. You know, what observations are you going to see? What conditions are out there? The criterion we talked about, the cause and the effect. But what are some examples of things you see in this photograph that the inspector might want to note? Give me some examples in the photograph. Give me some examples. The elevation of the layers, are they built to the right thickness? Yep. What was the quality of the compaction? Yeah. Okay. Are the curbs put in properly? Is it at the right height? Okay. Is the material placed behind the curb enough? Is the drainage proper? Is there enough crown? There isn't in this case. Okay. These are all things that could be monitored. And I hope somebody noticed, why is there a cone in the compacted layer? Point these things out. A good working relationship can actually help the project if we work and realize we each have a role to play. One of the things I don't see enough when I talk to people when it comes to job of the inspector, and we need to do this more often, be sure to document what was done well. Don't just write down the things that are not done well. Write down the things that are done well. That's just as important as the things that might need to be corrected. Document what's been fixed and what's been installed properly. Okay. So observations here. Let's talk about this. This is a roadway. It's not a construction project, but what conditions do you see here? Yeah, there's an arrow that's wrong. What criterion should be followed? What for that sign? What conditions do you think should have been followed? Where am I going to follow this? The MUTCD. Yeah, everybody knows about the MUTCD. What do you think the cause was? Could be wind. Yeah, could be a broken bolt. Um, don't assume. That's the one thing I would say more than anything else. Don't assume. Go over and look, document what happened. You know, did the bolt shear? Uh, did the wind blow it over? You may not be able to tell everything, so you write down what you see. Don't assume anything and don't guess. Write down the cause as much as you can, or things that could be used to determine the cause later on, and of course the effects. In this case, the effect could be a safety issue, but you can imagine that on other ideas as well. Okay? So keep that in mind as you're doing inspections. It doesn't have to be a lot of detail, but there are forms and you should follow them. You can have your own documentation and fill it out under the forms if you need to. Okay? Now, in terms of inspection records, okay, there's a section in the chapter 15 that deals with inspection records. This is more of what you're keeping and why you're keeping it. Okay? And who's responsible? Who has the overall responsibility? The project manager. Could be the EIC, but again, easy way to remember it, just think about somebody within the local agency, that full-time person is the person who's responsible. And they're following it by using the manual uniform record keeping, MERC, okay? And the cool stuff is it's all reimbursable if you document it, okay? Now, I just want to touch briefly on a different kind of inspection. We haven't talked about it much, but it does come up and they may get involved. You may see Federal Highway coming in to do some inspections, depending on the job, where they do this and how much they do. A really big project, they may be really involved in deep. Other ones may just do an initial and a final. Again, because they're focused on the issue of federal aid, they're going to be looking at the construction management plan, DBE goals, paperwork aspects of the work. They may come in the middle of the project, just do a spot check, see how things are going, see if there's any issues. You may see them involved, or they may want to get involved with some specific stuff if it's a critical project in depth. And then, of course, there may be a final inspection. It's not the final inspection on the job. This is Federal Highway looking at the process and making sure that what was intended was actually built. And did time extensions make sense? Did change orders make sense? Things like that. So just want to keep that in the back of your mind. It's nothing major, but if you see them involved, that's why. So let's talk about change orders. Again, there's a section in the chapter 15 4.2 on change orders. Okay, change orders can get us in trouble, but let's talk about them. And again, we're going to open up uh, a thing here. Okay, and we have legitimate change order items. I don't know why we're getting this active. I want a list of legitimate change order items here. Okay, I don't know why Poll EV is giving us this, but what would be a good example of legitimate change order items? Okay, hazardous materials found. Yep. Okay, a quantity overrun, possibly. Weather. Some people are putting it in the Q&A. Okay, okay. Time extension. Now we're going to keep time extensions separate from change orders, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. There actually is a different section. Unforeseen conditions, unanticipated conditions, such as rock. Okay. Weather, a delay of delivery, something that was under the soil that wasn't caught. Okay. Bridge abutments not matching the record plans for a rehab, for instance, would be a good example. An increase in quantity, maybe. You got to be careful with increase in quantity. Was it something that was being done legitimately, or was there a good reason for it? Field conditions different, added work. Okay. Think about legitimate change order items. Okay. You essentially should make a change when there's a reason to do so. Somebody put in the Q&A, pandemic effects. Yeah, that could be pretty important. Okay. There are lots of things we think are legitimate, they may not be. So be careful about that. Somebody says, well, I didn't realize I had to have everybody wearing hard hats. No, you can't. That's not a legitimate change order item. That's something that should have been covered by the contractor when they were bidding out the project. Okay. So it has to be something that's legitimate. And COVID-19 obviously was a major one that does that because it does, as someone said in the Q&A, it does determine responsibility of who will pay for things. Okay. So got to be done. And by the way, there's an example of one that would not be fuel surcharge. If it's part of a state contract, that should be in the plans. Now, you don't need a change order if the contract plans already cover the change. Okay. So accommodations to property owners may or may not be a contract change, depending whether it's legitimate or not. So always ask yourself the why question. Why is this change being made? Is it something that's legit, or is it something that is the contractor is trying to either pull a fast one, or more likely they just missed something? But why should you be paying for that? Okay. So once you've decided something is legitimate, then you got to decide you're going to move on. But again, keep these things in mind as we move forward with contract changes. Okay. So a contract change could be the change of scope. Okay. Uh, it could be a cost overrun or even an underrun possibility. Yeah. Changes to plans or specs. Somebody mentioned in the Q&A, is there a process for design omission? That's where you would do this. It would be a change of plans or specs if something got missed. Okay. There's some slope that's wrong or some missing steel. You'd want to do a change order if there's something in the omission. Um, it may stop a project for a while redesign is checked. Okay. New or modified pay items. All of a sudden there's a change. You know, if there's a new federal requirements or there's a new state requirements, that's a new modification. If you're going to get paid differently, you're going to need to think about a contract change. Okay. You're going to adjust payments due to the contract. If that is built into the contract, that may not need a change order. Okay. But if you have to adjust payments above and beyond the contract, keep it that. And the contract may require you to do that. So be careful about that particular one. A lot of people list it, but if it's in the contract, you don't need a change order for it. Okay. Changing contract requirements. Yeah, if you're changing what the contractor has to do, absolutely. That would be a good example. And of course, the unforeseen conditions, utilities by far being the most common. Okay. Now, how could we have overcome a lot of these activities? Where actually in our whole process might we want to really focus on solving these problems? In the design phase? Possibly. Where else? Scoping. Yeah. Maybe even all the way back to planning. And if you're developing your scope and you think you've got a project and you're like, boy, we really haven't done enough investigation or we need to get more input from the public, maybe you got to step back to planning. In design, you may have to step back to scoping. A little money up front in an extra boring or two or a test pit might make a huge difference later on. Okay. And the survey, yeah, can make a big difference. The quality of those surveys up front and can save a lot of money. So there are questions we should always be asking. Use the same set of questions. When you were in elementary school, they talked about those 6 W's, and then the smart aleck like myself in the back of the room goes, one of those starts with an H, but there are 6 questions we were always asked. Ask those same questions on your change order. Who, what, where, when, why, and how. Of those 6, which one comes first? Which one comes first? Why? Yeah. Why is this change necessary? Okay. Is it legitimate? What is the change? How will this impact the scope or the design? Where is the change? Is it inside the range of the project? If it's outside it, you may not get reimbursed for it. You have to be in the right of way, for instance. When is it on the schedule? Does it then also involve a time extension? Okay. Who's responsible and therefore who should pay? Okay. So always start with why, answer all the who, what, where, when, why, and hows, and you'll be in pretty good shape. But start with why. Okay. Now, there's a process for this. The MERC, the Manual of Uniform Traffic, Uniform Record Keeping, different MU, has a form in it, an authorization of extra work. So you'll want to look in the MERC to get that. You'll prepare a change order. It's reviewed by the New York State Department of Transportation, and they're going to look, is it eligible for federal aid? Is there an impact on the scope? What time adjustments are needed or things like that. Okay. Now, as a reminder, what is this term change order called in a lot of state documentation? What term do they use other than change order? In the Q&A, what term do they use? Order on contract. Yep. OOC. Yeah. Order on contract. It means pretty much the same thing. Okay. So some things need to get prior approval before you can do them. Things that are considered significant if it's on the National Highway System. So what kind of things would be significant? Okay. So give me some examples of things that require prior approval. You can't just do a change order and get approved later on. Okay. So give me some examples. A huge change in quantity. Okay. Over 125%. Okay. A brand new structure, a project beyond the boundary. So therefore you have to change the contract limit. Yeah, that's significant. Absolutely. Okay. Item that's not in the contract. Maybe. I mean, it depends how big the item is. If it's small, it actually may not be. It's the idea of major cost changes outside the contract limits. And I'm looking for one more that I haven't seen yet. Right of way, yep. Non-approved materials, yeah, that's going to need some help. That's going to need help for different reasons, not just change orders. There's one in here I haven't seen listed. I want to make sure we don't forget about it. Let me look in the Q&A. Make sure it's got to be compliant. It's got to be a staffing plan. New York City, everybody says everything. Yeah. If the change order is going to cause the project to exceed the contract limits, in other words, how much money is available, that's a significant change. You definitely need prior approval if you're going to go outside the amount of money that's available. So if you're getting close to your limits on your contract for how much money you've got to make sure you have approval ahead of time. Okay. Now, when is it not required? Minor changes within the scope. Okay. A small quantity increase or decrease, for instance. Large ones may need to require this. Okay. A new item is actually okay if it's not significant. If you're changing from uh, one type of uh, post to another, it's not structural, it's aesthetic. You do a change order, you're okay. Okay. And a field change is usually okay. Again, if it's not significant, if it doesn't cause a major issue in terms of the costing or the scope of the location. Key. What is the most important thing again? Funding. Nope, communication. Funding is going to be key, but you got to communicate this. If you're not sure, just pick up the phone, talk to the RLPL, and the engineer in charge or who's ever on site prepares the change order to the RLPL. They can help you figure out, do you have to do it ahead of time, or can you get the contractor working and then prepare the change order? Okay. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Okay. And we'll say this again and again and again. Now, this is important enough. I'm going to do a series of questions today, and you'll know we're doing questions because the color has changed. Okay. So in the Q&A pod, please put in an answer to these questions. Okay. And I'll read them to you. Does FHWA and the state have approval authority after review of a change order or just concurrence? Does FHWA and the state have approval authority? They always have concurrence. It depends on the PODI. Very good. Somebody got it. It depends on the project division interest level. If it's a division level 1, FHWA has to do approval. If it's lower than that, it would be the state who would be doing the approvals. Okay. And again, they'd be using this form, and just because somebody noted it, so I'll put it in here. I do have my pen still. The form you need when my pen wakes up is CO. Come on, you wake up today. You're just going to be that way, aren't you? NR-104. Okay. So that's the form you'll fill out to get approval for a change on order on contract or a change order. Okay. After reviewing a change order, it seems the requested work falls outside the original scope of work. What would be the following steps to take? What would be the steps to take? Discuss with the RLPL. You may need to get approval by others like the MPO. You may have to rebid it depending on how much of a change it is. Okay. So you got to be careful. You can't go outside the scope. That's got to be prior approval. And make sure you talk. Okay. And if there's a disagreement, you may have to use your disagreement processes in place. Okay. And yes, you may need some FHWA approval at that point, even for lower level projects. Does the RLPL need to approve all change orders? I see a bunch of yeses. The RLPL needs to approve all change orders. Okay. Now, it may be as simple as a concurrence, but if you're not sure which level it is, just assume yes. It's much easier to ask the question and then they go, okay, you're fine, than to approve it. Contractor starts working and it turns out you shouldn't have. If you're doing an order on contract change, please talk to the RLPL. Just assume yes. It's easier than anything else. Don't assume no because you can't go back. Easy enough to pick up the phone. And again, what form do we use? Oh, I made a mistake here, but I think you guys will get it right. What form do we use? CONR 104. Yep. And again, I can't fix this in the middle, and I'm not going to do a change order. As you can see, I missed my zero. I need a little zero in here. Okay. But it's not going to draw very well. It should be CONR 104. Okay. So let's talk about time extensions a little bit. Time extensions are pretty important. Um, they're different than change orders, but they're similar. The key here is changes in the schedule, but there's no monetary changes. Okay. Now you may need both, but let's look at the schedule and time extensions. And we really want to avoid these when we can. The public hates them. It does increase your exposure to risk. Um, there's more administrative cost, some of which may not be eligible, depending. And of course, there can be a cost extension as well. So we want to avoid that. So, terms of project schedule oversight, just put in here what you think are the kind of things that you could put into the schedule to make sure you stay on schedule. What kind of things can you do to monitor and make sure you have a good time schedule? Okay. And while you're putting those in, someone in the Q&A put, does the RLPL need to review if it's a $0 change order? For example, minor quality additions or deductions. Well, first off, if it's a minor quantity, it's still going to be a cost change. And even if it's just a replacement in kind, they might just concur. Don't assume. Please always just contact the RLPL for any change order. It's safer that way because there may be a reason why that you just pick up the phone. Okay. But yeah, we're getting some pretty good ideas for this. Milestones, your Gantt chart is absolutely vital. Follow that Gantt chart. What is the critical path? Now, yeah, that doesn't fall directly into here. That should have been done in the design phase or even scoping. But you got to look ahead, know what's the project delays. Can you get unexpected delays? Well, of course, you expected a delivery coming through the Suez Canal. You might have had a delay you had to deal with. And of course, when that happens, you need to update the CMP and you need to reset the charts. Okay. Good examples, good things to think about. Again, build the project in your head ahead of time. Okay. And regular meetings. That's the job of the inspector in the EIC. Okay. And yes, it's now fixed in the Suez Canal, but there's still going to be a backup. So you need to know your contract deadlines. What are your contract times? Okay. What's the initial schedule look like? We talked about critical path. Have a plan. Does the plan make sense? Does it look realistic? If it doesn't, think about that. If you're assuming you're going to work 20 days straight with no rain, that's probably not realistic. Okay. Have you built in some slack time? A lot of newer project management plans actually think slack time may be more important than critical path. And I don't necessarily disagree. Having some slack time can be very, very valuable. Okay. And of course, as these things are happening, who's responsible? Is it really the contractor that just got hit blindsided by something, or could a reasonable individual that said they should have been planning for this. They didn't order what they needed even close to when they should have ordered it. Who's responsible for the cost change? So ask the questions why. Okay. Now, there are different times of time extensions. Think about this. If it's a time extension where the contractor had some control, okay, and it's within the contractor's control, then you're probably going to let them do it, but there shouldn't be a cost issue involved in that. It really should be something where that's part of the contractor's responsibility. You shouldn't be paying for something that's within their control. That's why they bid something, okay? Versus things that are outside the contractor's control, where then you start talking about, okay, now we might have to do some cost changes as well because it's not the responsibility of the contractor. Hopefully, you've built some of this into the contract provisions, okay? So you can include that. Whether there is an engineering change or without, are there going to be liquidated damages? Okay. Now, if there's not an engineering charge involved in that, and there's within the contractor's control, hopefully they just do a time extension, you're done, unless there's a penalty clause. If it's outside, you might have to do a charge. Okay. And yes, it may cost the agency some money because of time. So it's something you're going to have to include, hopefully, in your plans that you've got an agreement on. Okay. There might be an engineering change in that case, though, because remember, you're changing the inspection, you're changing the cost. But if it's your own people, you just don't show up on the job site for a while. There's not really a cost to the contractor. Again, engineering changes could include the cost of the engineering inspection. Okay. And of course, is there a liquidated damage? Okay. Oh, you're right. No, it's engineering charges. You're right. I should have put charges in there. I typed changes in. Yep. Good point. Good catch. Going to make a note because I want to change that. Uh, Now I've got all of you watching my slides. But that's okay. Now, time extension approvals, again, same thing. Ask the why. It needs to be justified and documented. It approved by the sponsor. Now, this is an odd one, but it does happen. You have to submit them 30 days before the contract is complete and done. Okay? So if you've got some reason you need to add a week towards the end of the project, you're going to have to extend that project enough time to have a full review. So 30 days minimum, nothing last minute. Okay. And then you submit them to the RLPL for approval. Okay. And you have to list all proper delays and improper. You list all delays. It's easy enough. Again, pick up the phone, talk to the RLPL. Okay. Now, you do have to have insurance. Okay. This does happen. You're getting near the end of a contract. The insurance carrier is set to cover the contract. Actually, I was just approving our insurance literally this morning that we've got. Our contract insurance goes from here to here to here. If we did a time extension and the contract insurance ends on, say, October 1st, but we want to extend that project to the end of November, you need to make sure the insurance is extended as well. That's a major issue, especially in construction because of the risk involved. So make sure the insurance is in place to the end of the entire contract completion date. Okay. Some other contract issues. Obviously, claims is going to be an issue that comes up. You know, who's going to get involved with that? Are there contract terminations? If you need to get rid of a contractor or a subcontractor, these are issues to keep in mind. There's legal issues that might come up. Uh, all kind of possibilities. So let's ask a few questions and make sure we're on the same page on this. So when should the state local agreement, this is the agreement that you're essentially using to get paid later on, when should a state local agreement no cost time extension be submitted? When? This is not, it's a when question. Okay, and by the way, the abbreviation is NCTE. Prior to contract termination, but at least How many days before the end of the contract? 30 days. Very good. Okay. There's no time limit, but remember, every time you put in paperwork, it slows the process down. So pick up the phone, talk to the RLPL, make sure it's justified, documented, and give some time for review. Okay. Now, in terms of subcontractors, 15.4, yeah, you still should do them as quickly as possible. Yeah, for time extensions. I just pick up the phone. Subcontractors. This is the language from the federal rules that the prime contractor must perform 30% of the original contract price. Here in New York State, is that correct? Anybody know? No. What should that number be? Yeah. Here in New York State, it's 50%. And that's a perfect example, by the way, of where the local rule, in this case state, but still the local rule actually supersedes the federal rule because it's stricter. The state is allowed to increase the percentage that the prime must perform, in this case 50%. Okay, so you may see documentation from federal stuff that says 30. It's 50% here in New York State. Okay. Subcontractors are approved by the sponsor. Okay. And you do this to make sure that they're eligible to work here in New York State. Okay. And then you got to notify the RLPL that there's a subcontractor on the job. Pick up the phone. Okay. You got to have a hotline to this person. Set up some meetings. Okay. Who certifies someone is eligible to do work in New York State, by the way? What agency actually does that certification here in New York? It's not the Department of Labor. They have to be a registered company here in New York. And they actually have to be with, yep, there you go, the Department of State. They actually have a website that lists all of the possible agencies. In fact, as we'll talk about good faith efforts and things of that ilk with DBEs, the Department of State's listing of businesses can actually be a place to go to find some names. So the Department of State. Now, there is a form, an extra form you have to fill out if you're on a national highway system road or a state highway for your subcontractors. I looked at the form. It's not bad, but it's just a couple of extra questions that have to be asked. And there is a vendor responsibility office. There's people that look at these kind of things. Now, when it comes to disputed work, again, the section in the book or in the chapter is 15.4.5. Disputed work, i.e., a disagreement between you, the sponsor, and the contractor. Okay. There is a required clause that has to be in the contract documents. It's a change conditions clause, a differing site conditions clause. There's text already there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's already done. The real key is how do you resolve the dispute? Okay. And so those clauses help you because they give you some of the language to start from. The goal here is when there's an unresolved dispute, it's going to lead to claims. Hopefully, you can go back to those two clauses. Everybody comes to an agreement, you move on. If not, you may have to use an alternative dispute resolution. Okay. There are some procedures you can set that up. You can put it into the plans and all that. And then, of course, you have a last step. This is where you do not want to go, but that is you could go to court. uh, that is really something we don't want to be doing if we can avoid it. Uh, we had a person who taught some of our legal classes for us here at the LTAP Center, and he always said, "Look, you want a good lawyer, but the last thing you want your lawyer to do is go to court. But there's a reason to go to court, and sometimes you have to. But hopefully, we can do that before then." There is a standard. It's in the state specifications. It's in section 105. Okay. This is also listed directly in chapter 15. You don't have to remember this. It's already right in the chapter. It tells you where to go. This is the text from it. Okay? I'm not going to read you the whole section, but there is two words in here I really want you to understand. And we're essentially saying in all of this is there's a whole bunch of stuff you need to do, but you're continuing to work. Work continues even when there is a dispute. You don't just stop. Okay? You keep working. And then you may have to have some periods involved, and you may have to do some changes because of settlement, and you may have to do a time extension because of it. But work continues. Now, I want you to notice something on this. What's the date that you see in the top right there? September of 2020. This is an updated section. So you may want to look at it carefully if you've got a project that's coming up, or if you've got an ongoing project. This is the standard now. So be sure you're aware of the small changes that have occurred. But the key takeaway is work continues. We keep working. When there's disputes in work, obviously we can try to do it with a phone call, but at some point it's going to be submitted in writing. Okay? What's the next step if the contractor submits a dispute or you've got a dispute you put in writing? What happens next? Who's the next person we contact? RLPL. You notify the RLPL immediately. Pick up the phone, give them some contact. Then we're going to create some guidance. We're going to start looking at things. Okay? Whether the cost to settle the disputes are paid for, this is reviewed by DOT. Okay? So you're going to have to look at the reasons why. Okay? One of the things to remember is if there is a dispute, it has to be resolved before the contract is closed out. Okay? So it may go all the way up the main office at that point. Okay? There's a 30-day window for dispute resolution that gets involved and gets invoked, depending on how the process goes. But you got to resolve it. You can't leave open-ended disputes. You have to have an agreement on those before the project can be closed out. And we'll talk more about this tomorrow in the first hour. The RLPL can help you, but remember, they don't arbitrate or mediate. Their real role is to help guide and figure out what steps are involved. You'd have to bring somebody else in for a mediation issue. Okay? Buy America. Buy America creates a lot of issues on federal aid projects. We're going to spend a little bit of time on this, but realize it's probably not as bad as people think. Okay? Essentially, it affects steel or iron products. And what it essentially says is that foreign materials must be less than 0.1% or 2,500 of the cost of the steel or iron products that are part of the project. So if you're building a bridge with rebar, they count. If you're building a bridge with a big steel beam, that counts. Okay. This can include, by the way, any coatings that go on the steel or iron products. Okay. Yes, it could include sewer grates and covers. Steel or iron. Okay. Easy way to remember it. Okay. And it's in place. It's been around for a while. It's the amount based upon delivery. Okay. You have to track this a little bit. You may have heard something called Buy American. Can be very confusing when you get all these different products out there. Buy American is different. Okay. It's not included in federal aid. I just want you to be aware of it. You see Buy American, make sure the ANA is or isn't there. That has to do with procurement issues and federal requirements for what they purchase. There are some very small project times when they may overlap. Okay. If you were working on federal lands or something, but very, very rarely do you have to worry about Buy American. If you're not sure, talk to their RLPL, but generally, Buy American is a different process. Now, you are allowed to use non-domestic steel in certain cases. Okay. Obviously, if the amounts are small, minimal use, temporary use, with some exceptions we'll talk about. There are some alternative bid procedures that are available. Okay. Again, go get help. We don't have time today to get into too much detail on that. And you can get a waiver, though, as we're going to see in just a second. Uh, it's hard to get a waiver. Okay, so it's pretty tough. And if it's structural, don't assume you're going to get a waiver. With We'll talk about exceptions. So here's the thing to remember: if it's temporary, okay, and that means it can be removed when you're done, Buy America does not apply. But if it's going to stay, even though it's not part of the original contract, but it's going to have to stay because it's underneath the bridge or it's around the pilings, you just can't pull it out, it's not really temporary. So if it's going to be in place and pulled out, yep, you might be able to not use Buy America. Generally, these are things contractors use again and again and again. So put in for me some examples of things where Buy America would apply, where you're going to have to count it against your whole Buy America. Sheet piling, yeah, they're not being pulled out. Okay, probably. We don't take sheet piling out. Steel I-beams, of course, yeah. Bridge steel, yeah. Anything structural. I see people putting in fire hydrants, signal poles, sewer frames, and covers. Yeah, anything with iron and steel, pretty much. Okay, so it's an easy thing. You just document this stuff. And the main thing is you got to document that it came from a domestic source. Okay. So if it's iron or steel, just make sure that it is something you track. Yeah. If you want to buy something that's non domestic and put it into the project, it has to be approved prior to installation. Okay. And what you have to show is that the materials are not produced in the United States in sufficient and reasonable quantities. Now, I have actually done a project where we purchased a non-US product. It was a ball joint that was only produced in Germany, and we did a lot of effort to find a domestic source. Could not find one, and but we had to document that. We'll talk about how you do that in just a second. Realize schedule is not a driver. Just because it takes longer to get it here in the States doesn't mean you can get a waiver. Okay? It has to be something because literally you can't get it either in the quantity you need or the quality you need in the public interest. Okay. So, when do you think you should be talking about the waiver in our overall process? When should we really be talking about the need to get a waiver on Buy America? Yeah, scoping. Yeah, possibly. Yep. Possibly all the way back to planning. Yeah. Pre construction. The latest you should talk about Buy America is design. Before you do PS&E, you really need to know if you need a waiver. Don't wait until you get to construction. It's too late. Okay? Because by then you're already into the construction process and all it's going to do is slow things down. So make sure you've actually done it before you finish with the design. And yeah, someone said it depends on the contractor. If you can find a domestic source, it's going to have to be the contractor can't say, oh, no, 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 I don't like to use that product. No, no, no. If there's a domestic source, they got to use it. And it's going to be really hard to get a waiver. Because here's the process. First, the State Transportation Agency, i.e., NYSDOT, has to request a waiver through the division with all the documents. Then the division has to do a review and send it up to FHWA headquarters. FHWA headquarters is then going to host public comments. This is going to speed the process up. They're going to do an in-depth review, and then it's going to go back to the State Highway Agency to resolve any comments before the waiver request is published in the Federal Register. Okay? That is not a quick process. And they're immediately going to ask, can you redesign it for a domestic product? They're going to look at things like the cost. Are there other people who could do this? Is it really something we have to do? Since 2001, 20 years, How many waivers do you think have been granted in New York State for all federal aid projects? How many? I got a 2, a 5, 5, a little more than that. The answer is 14. 14 waivers, less than one per year. Okay. And boy, it's going to require a lot of certification. Okay. It's going to require manufacturer certification that it's been done. Okay. And it's not going to be something that you can really get. So how soon should the sponsor notify us, i.e. the feds or the state, of Buy America concerns? Right away. In fact, if it's in construction, it's probably already too late. Yeah, good answer. If the request comes after the contractor agreed to the contract, what happens next? What do you think happens next? Yeah, it might be a rebid even. It's certainly going to be a change order. You might have to go to redesign or find an equal domestic product. It's going to slow the project down. Okay. But people are always wanting to do this, so that's why we're emphasizing this a little bit. Okay. What is the threshold on a $500,000 project for Buy America? It's 0.1%, so it becomes 2,500. Very good. People are good with their calculators. The break-even point is 25. 25 or 0.1. So the break-even point is 2.5 million. Okay, so anything less than 2.5 million, you're going to be in the 2,500 threshold. Okay, and that's going to be most of our local projects. We know that. But a big project, yeah, you might get a little more, but you're not going to get a lot. So do we have to include equipment such as benches, water fountains, bike racks? We're doing a project that's got a small park as part of it. What do you think? Yep. Iron or steel? Iron or steel? And contractor says items are just never manufactured domestically. Is that a good excuse? No. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. No, it's got to be a little more than that. You've done a reasonable effort to find other people. You've checked to see that there's no real manufacturers that could do this. And if you're not sure, what do? You contact the RLPO. Yeah. Like, you call Ghostbusters. You call the RLPO. Don't assume. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about prevailing wage, and then we'll probably take our second break with good timing on this. Okay. Again, this is 15.4.7. Prevailing wages is certainly a major issue for a lot of people. This falls under what section of law? What's the law this falls under at the federal level? Ah, yes, somebody got it. Davis-Bacon. Okay, so everybody can remember Bacon. That's easy, and then just Davis in front of it. So Davis-Bacon. It involves all of your laborers, your working men. Yes, that's what it says, and mechanics. It's maintained by the New York State Department of Labor. Okay, and how would you find the wages? I mean, how are you going to look up what the wages are for your particular, and it's by county, by the way. How are you going to look that up? You're just going to go to the website. Now you can go, and I'll see if my mouse will work here. Let's see. Are you going to work? Nope. I got to go back to pointer here. Okay. You can go to the web, and you can pull up the website, and it's nice and long, and everybody's like, "Good grief, how do I remember that?" Don't try to remember the website. All you got to remember is how to search. Okay, just search for prevailing wage and New York State Department of Labor, and up will come what you need. Okay, so in Tompkins County, for instance, you could look it up, and heavy flagger is $30.16 here in Tompkins County, where I am, and it's going to go up on July 1st. It's actually not hard to look up. You just got to document it. It does take some time, but you can download a lot of these things. Okay. At the end of the process, the key though is that the contractor is the one doing this. It's the contractor who has to certify that the things are being done. Okay. So they're going to be providing the EIC, or in some cases the project manager, with all of the certification for their own people, and they have to let the subcontractors know the prevailing wage schedule before they start working. It's actually the responsibility of the contractor to do this. And they're the ones who verify that the wages are being done. And if there's a change with a new schedule, they have to provide updated certifications. So a time extension requires an update to the prevailing wage affidavits that have been done. And of course, at the end of this process, there's a final labor affidavit given to the sponsor. Now, there's also something called wage rates interviews, a section in the chapter, and it's a pretty important one. So I want to make sure we understand that, and then we'll take our break. Okay? The wage rate has to be done for each new trade. So if you've got somebody coming in from an electrician's trade, you're going to have to do some interviews with them to make sure they're being paid properly. Generally, this is done at the first payday, and you have to do approximately at least one per trade. And of course, if it's a big project, multi-year, you're going to have to do them annually. And I know somebody's going, oh, how do I keep all that straight? As I said before, I everybody knows this. I'm not a big fan of paperwork, but I like forms. And yes, there is a form. The form will help you out. And just go search for it. It's easy enough to find the form. But again, it's the contractor who's doing a lot of this, and then you're doing the wage rate interviews to check everything out. In terms of payment to the subcontractors, okay? How long do we have to pay the subcontractor? 7 days. Okay. So when the subcontractor asks for money, or the contractor, you got to pay them in 7 days. The contractor the same way. You got a quick window. Now, federal law says 30 days. State law says 7 days. Again, another example that 7 days is the receipt of time that the subcontractor has to be paid after the sponsor has been notified. Okay. So once you get paid, the subcontractors have to be paid pretty quick. Okay. One question and we'll take our break. Does the acceptable prevailing rate change on a project if the rate changes during the project? Yes, absolutely. If the change, when you hit that change on July 1, and most of them change, you'll have to do a new certification with changes in the prevailing wage. Prevailing wage changes as the project goes. Okay. And with that, we are on slide. Okay. And we're going to take ourselves our break. And we'll be back at the top of the hour at 11 o'clock. See you then. Okay, we're going to start back up. Real quick point that I was talking to myself about. If you have to extend the state local agreement, even if it's just a no cost time extension, which you think, oh, that's easy, realize if it's extending the agreement with the state, that has to go down and get signatures from the Attorney General and the Comptroller's office. And that's, you know, yep, it could take 2 months. So be aware of that before we make any hasty bets. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about civil rights issues that come up quite a bit. This section will take us some time because we're going to cover not just what's in Chapter 15, but some additional things as well. Okay, so this is 15.4.8 in the chapter, but it's also going to cover some other issues. And really, all of this comes from the Code Rule of Federal Regulations, CFR, Part 26, Civil Rights Acts, all that stuff. And there's some state requirements on top as well. Now, more than anything else, this is where we have DBEs, another acronym, Disadvantaged Business Enterprises, and Equal Employment Opportunity, which covers everybody to some extent. Okay. Now, some of you have probably seen the initials MWBE for federal aid projects. We don't use that particular minority or women owned business enterprise process. That is a state process for state projects. If you're doing federal aid, you're using DBE. You're not using MWBE. Okay. So just be aware of that. You cannot have an MWBE goal on a federal aid project. Even if there's no DBE goal, even if it's a zero goal, you cannot have both. So if the DBE goal is set, that's it. Okay. Just want you to be aware of that. Remember that. It's DB for federal aid. The goals are narrowly tailored based by FHWA and NYSDOT in conjunction. There are some tools that NYSDOT has for creating those project level goals. If you're interested, you can talk with them about them. Um, it involves the type of work involved, where you are in the state, what is the availability of work that's out there, and of course, what are the number of people or companies involved who would meet some of the DBE issues. Okay. Now, the overall goals for the DBE program that exist, there's a commitment that you've got to meet. And this is something to realize. It's not based on the amount of money that's spent. It's commitment based upon the percentage of what is bid and awarded. Okay. So it's what you bid and awarded that you would do it on. Okay. So even if the amounts change, okay, the commitment you make is based upon that bid, but the attainment is based on what's actually spent. Okay. So, quick question for you, not one of our fancy colored ones. If the DBE commitment is 8% and the award amount is 500,000, what are you monitoring in this particular project? What are you monitoring? We'll see how people's calculators are working this morning, which really means their cell phones because everybody's got a calculator. $40,000. Yeah. So you would monitor the progress towards spending 40K, $40,000. Even if the price goes up or even if the price goes down, it's towards that number that you're really monitoring things. Now, to do all of this, most of this is done via reporting requirements, and I just combined the two sections on EEO and DBE monitoring and reporting. We don't use most of these forms that are in the Chapter 15 anymore. Most of the reporting is done via the EBO system. And I know there were a lot of comments last week about the EBO system. Um, I'm not going to get into too much of those. I'm just telling you this is where it's done. Okay. And any significant changes in DBE use needs to be communicated to the RLPL. So again, if you're not sure, pick up the phone and give a call. Okay. Talk to the RLPL. There is one form that's still not in the EBO reporting that you may want to have advantage of. Okay. It's in the resource list that's in the handout, so you don't have to remember this. It's already listed, and it's not actually part of the contract documentation. It's a workforce participation plan that exists. Okay. Um, that workforce participation plan is a spreadsheet that is filled out. When do you think it gets filled out? It's a plan. When in the process do you think it actually gets filled out? And it's, fancy in details. It does all the math for you. You don't have to do much other than putting numbers in. It's actually pretty cool. Way before pre-construction, way before pre-award. So it's in the design phase. This is actually part of design before you get to PS&E. Okay. So keep that in mind. But if the form is available, you've got a link in your handout, but also you can just search for Workforce Participation Plan NYSDOT and it'll pop right up. Okay. So I want you to be aware of that. Uh, it's really pretty simple. It lists all the different classes and all the different trades. And by the way, I actually think it's a pretty useful way to realize which ones you have to do prevailing wage interviews to see who's on that list. Because you even list the non DBE participants. So if you know there's a surveyor or an iron worker, you know to interview those people. So it's actually pretty good as a check. Okay. Now, a lot of this comes back to the concept of the good faith effort. We've heard this term a lot. A good faith effort essentially says, I can't meet the goal. Okay. What are some examples of good faith efforts? Things that you can say, I did these steps to find a DBE company or contractor and I couldn't do it. What is going to be something that counts towards good faith effort? An advertisement that goes out to everybody, a letter that's sent out to an organization or a series of organizations. Yep. What else? Okay. You could ask the Department of State. That listing I mentioned earlier is an extremely valuable tool. When we did a good faith effort ourselves once, that's actually how we found most of the companies we reached out to was through the Department of State's listing of organizations allowed to practice in New York State. Check with your trade organizations. You've got to prove that you did these things. You got to check. They want to check with the union hall when it comes to hiring people to make sure the contractor has done so. You may look at the list of existing DBE contractors. Um, one thing you can do, I said earlier that we're not going to use the MWBE system, but you can use that system to check with people who aren't currently listed as DBE and say, hey, could you join that? And maybe we could add you to the pool of people that would then get the letters of possible contract awards. Make a call log. The simplest thing to do is make yourself a log of the work that you do to document this, that you corresponded with people back and forth. Whether you do it on paper, Word, spreadsheet, yeah, all good things. How did you do it? You can check with different guilds and trade organizations. Yeah. It's correspondence. What you're looking for is you've made a good faith effort to look for people who are going to be able to do the job. But how'd you ask them to do it? Was it specialty work? Was it smaller chunks? Did you try to set it up so that they had a chance to bid? If it's a big project and the only people you're allowing to bid are big companies, you may be limiting things too much. And that's where we should be looking at using subs. Okay. Now, most of this should be done prior to the award. Okay. But you can do good faith efforts through the entire project. So let's say that the contractor who won the award hadn't met the full DB participation in their proposal. That doesn't mean they're done just because you've awarded it to them. They've got to continue to look for and meet the DBE goals. Okay. They got to continue to look at the directory from New York State for possible companies. Okay. If it's post award, remember, you're going to continue to look for possible companies to fill in roles that haven't already been filled in. They must be new. Okay. They can't just be repeating of what you've already done. Okay. Uh, Someone asks them the DB if the DB goal is met near finishing the project. Are you done? No, you got to keep looking. That's actually one of the requirements in the DBE process. Even if we meet the goal of, say, our 40K, we're still looking for companies that are meeting the DBE requirements. A good way to do this is just get in the habit of keep looking for good subs if you're a contractor. And if you're talking to the contractors as a sponsor, just remind them there's always good companies out there. And you may find one you really like. You may not use them a lot, but for specialty work, it could be very valuable. So keep looking and don't stop. So let's do a quick case study looking at the process. Come on, computer, you can do it. There you go. Okay, so here's our EBO form. I'm going to blow it up to the number I really care about, which is the percent attainment. Okay, so in this particular project, we've got 87% of the DBE goal met. Okay, so ask yourself the question, um, what's next? What do you think they have to do next? Okay, oops, didn't want to go there. So what is the contractor going to be doing at this point? You've certified that they're at 87%. What conclusions would you make? How are you going to increase it? You're not done. The prime is close, but they're not there yet. They need to continue to do good faith efforts. Okay? Yep. You got to keep going. Okay? So they still got to submit good faith efforts, not only until they attain the 100%, but they may have to keep doing it even after that. You may have to re-advertise some things. Okay? And make sure they're talking with actual people and not just filling out forms. Okay? So let's see what happens in a situation, and we have some fake companies. These are fake names from fake companies that were given to me by FHWA, so they'll look real familiar in the last name world. Okay, so we've got some subcontractors that have been initially improved. Okay, 3 of them. But as we're getting the project started, the first company, Millington Surveying, they've lost their DBE status. They're no longer certified as a DBE firm for whatever reason. Okay. Another subcontractor that you've got, the Hogan Construction, no issues, they're still good. And then another company, Gatchel Striping, would not stripe at night, and the contractor didn't realize that that was in the contract requirements, that they had to do the striping at night. Okay, so that's a loss, quite a bit of loss of funds that are available. Okay, so if someone sent you a list that essentially says, well, Millington lost its DBE and Gatchel wouldn't stripe at night, how are you going to respond to that? Are you just going to say, oh, it's okay, you're good? What are you going to ask them to start doing? What are you going to ask? You're going to have to find some replacements. Yeah. So, yeah, you can continue to use Hogan, but you're going to have to look at some others. You're going to have to find some alternatives, look at some different subs. Who else have they contacted? Okay. You might even have to say, well, I had a sub that was going to do um, some side work, maybe driveway approaches if it's a paving job. You might have to look at it, finding a different sub to do that work if you've lost the other contractors. Could you do it with trucking? Could you do it with some other technique? Maybe you increase the amount of work you give to Hogan Construction. Yeah, good idea. Okay. Don't just say, well, they lost their DB, but they had it when I started. No, it's when they're doing the work, they have to have the DBE status. So that's pretty important to keep in mind. The key is, what are the reasons given if you want to make a DBE change? Okay. If they said something like, well, for Millington survey, uh, wake up, I actually want to read this. Come on. We ended up using Millington survey for the survey, but we got no DBE credit. But there are no DB surveyors that we could use that are familiar with and we're comfortable with on a project like this one. Is that acceptable? What would you tell somebody like that? Yeah, no. Just because they're not familiar with them isn't a good faith effort. Okay. You really need to look at a little bit beyond that. Okay. And of course, with the striping one, um, we would not stripe at night, so we had to use another firm that wasn't a DBE. No, that's not a good faith effort. You have to do a little more than that. Okay. So give me some examples of some good faith efforts. And when the computer decides to wake up, it's going to open up one of those poll everywhere questions. Do, 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 do. I almost rebooted during the break, but we didn't. Here we go. So give me some good cause reasons for a DBE change. Give me some reasons that would be acceptable, that you can say, I can't meet the DBE goal. I may need to reduce it. Possibly COVID. Possibly. But remember, that's a delay for everybody. It's not just a delay for DBEs, it's a delay for everybody. So that may not actually be one. I did a good regional search. There's no one in the area. It's very specialized work that nobody else does. There's no available firms in the trades that are literally anywhere that's reasonable that are allowed to work here in New York. Scheduling. Mm-mm. Scheduling is probably not going to fly unless you have a other secondary reason. You need to have a little bit more details than that. Just scheduling alone won't work. You need more details. All the DBEs in your area are busy. If you can document that they're all booked up, and so you have to go outside, that's fine. But you're going to have to show that this is something that affects the schedule adversely to the public. Okay. And remember, you got to show the documentation of efforts. Okay. Now, there are some things you could look at. It's too large a percentage. Uh, you won't win that one. You won't win that one. Okay. Now, a couple of things you can do. If you have a contract with a DB firm and they fail or refuse to meet the requirements and they have an agreement, yeah, you can get some credit for that um, because they did their job and then the DB didn't follow through. Yeah, that's fine. If they don't do the work properly, okay. Now realize that if you catch them not doing the work and essentially take them off the job, you're going to have to go back to the effort of finding another DB subcontractor. Okay. You can put requirements on them just like you put on everybody else for bonding and discrimination and things like that. They have to meet those. If the DBE had gone bankrupt during the process, you might be able to get some reduction for that. But again, you should immediately also start looking for firms that still meet the DB requirements while you talk with others about not meeting it. Okay. And does this start the day they're removed from the program? Yeah, actually, immediately as soon as you lose a DBE, go ahead and start making the good faith effort. Look around. So don't just hire the first firm. Go look and see, is there a firm that could fill in for that DBE? That's the idea of the good faith effort. Okay. That you're really looking for somebody who can meet it who is a DBE. Okay. If it's outside your control, the DB owner passes away or the DB voluntarily withdraws and says, I can't meet this obligations, you may be able to get a reduction, but don't assume. Okay. Don't assume. Now, they have to be approved prior to doing the work. Okay. They have to be approved in writing. Okay. And there has to be some consent given. It has to be written consent that it's been approved. Okay. So the contractor can't just say, I'm not going to meet it. No, 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 no. They have to get you to sign off that it's prior, written, and approved. Okay. Now, what happens if the prime contractor is an EBE? I got good news. They're going to do 50% of the work. Remember, it's the DBE requirement for the contract. So that's good news for you if they're the prime contractor is a DBE. Okay. But that contractor should still be trying to find good DBEs. That's actually just, if you think about it, we really should always be looking for uh, folks to have as much breadth and width as possible, different firms out there. Okay. Now, if you have to do a good faith effort, the reason you want to do it immediately is you really got 7 days to make some good faith effort to look for other people. Don't wait until the end of the contract to try to stuff it in at the very end. It's too late. You want to do it as soon as possible. You really need to start documentation within a week. And people doing the work have to do something called a CUF. What does CUF stand for? Let's see if you'll get your acronyms. How you doing your acronyms? I know I gave you a tough one, CUF. And it's not Cornell University football. Commercially useful function. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They're doing something that is useful, distinct for that contract. Okay? They're not just there to fill a role to meet the DBE. Okay? It's not you're not worried about their size. You're not saying, oh, they do good work. No, they're doing a commercially useful function. Okay? So they're managing their own people, their own employees. They have their own equipment. Okay? So the evaluation involves different groups. And in chapter 15, you can read a little bit about some of these. There's actually several different chapters in the Local Projects Manual that talks about what is useful for the workforce, what is useful for the equipment, what documentation is needed for all of these different activities. Even the supervision needs to have a commercially useful function. If the contractor is doing all of the supervision of the people who are the subcontractor, that's not really a subcontractor with a commercially useful function. You're just trying to use them as workers. You really need businesses involved in the whole process from workforce down to materials. Okay? So this is something to keep in mind as you're doing all of these activities, as you're evaluating whether it's commercially useful and the DBE. Now, there's forms for this. A lot of them are online. They're inside the EBO. Uh, please don't read this. Remember, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, forms help figure out the right questions to ask. So you can ask the questions that are in the EBO and you don't have to remember everything. Okay? So it's a good way to remind yourself of asking questions about who's doing the work. Are they actually working for the prime and they're just listed over here to meet the DBE requirement? No, no, no. You got to be independent if they're going to be part of a DBE. But that's a useful thing to look at. So let's do a case study. We have a DBE subcontractors to furnish and install rebar on a bridge deck. Okay, what? A review of the documents submitted with the material certification shows the steel was delivered and invoiced to the prime contractor. Okay, so you get all this paperwork. So remember, you got a DB subcontracted to get the rebar and to furnish it. The review of the paperwork says the steel was delivered and invoiced to the prime contractor. What does this documentation indicate? Okay, we're going to get you a choice here. The documentation indicates the DB negotiated price and ordered the rebar. Does that documentation say further review is required? The documentation says the DB only needs to submit proof of payment to demonstrate CUF, or the DBE did not perform a commercially useful function of CUF. What do you think? Yeah, I think you got this one pretty well, and I got people B. Yep. Yeah, it looks like pass through, doesn't it? Yeah. You really don't know, if the steel was delivered, but was it installed, and was it actually delivered by the sub? For it to be a commercially useful function, the sub needs to have furnished, i.e., ordered and gotten the material delivered and put it into the proper place on the structure. That's what you need. This is just one element. You don't know enough yet. So you're going to need more review. And that happens more often than you might think. So if you're not sure, document it. And that's where your inspectors could really help you quite a bit. They can help you document who's doing what activity. So later on, you can check things. Okay. Now, in terms of calculations, remember we're talking to do a certain amount of cost. Okay. So let's look at the calculations of commercially useful functions and what percentage of the work they do you can count towards that number, whether it's 40K or 200,000 or whatever the number happens to be off the award. If you hire a subcontractor, okay, generally it's 100% of their work, but it might be less. Why might it be less than 100%? What examples might it be less than 100%? When might the subcontractor actually be less than 100%? We're going to talk about trucking in just a second. Yeah, the contractor helped them. That's the key. The contractor helped them out. So they really weren't doing something completely independent. Going back to our example with the rebar, okay? So let's say that, for instance, the subcontractor was supposed to furnish and install the steel. But as you're inspecting the records, you realize that subcontractors supplied all the steel, but contractors' crews helped install it. And about half the time was the subcontractors, and half the time was the contractor's crew out there putting the steel in place. So you'd have to account only for the parts that were actually done by the subcontractor. Now, it should show up in the payroll, but just check to make sure. So it's usually 100, but it could be a little bit less depending on if they're helping each other. Okay, so keep that in mind. Trucking, generally at 100%. Okay, but there are some caveats. There's a star here. Why did I star trucking? What are the requirements for a DBE to be counted as a commercially useful function for trucking? They have to have their own drivers and got drivers. What else do you have to have? And their own trucks. They either have to own the trucks or they have to have a long-term lease on the trucks. They can't just rent them. They have to have the trucks essentially in their fleet. Okay. Now, there are some different trucking options that count for other states, but here in New York State, we only count those trucks that are with the drivers and trucks owned by the company. Okay. So it's pretty important to know, hey, did we rent a truck for the day? You wouldn't actually count that particular truck. You might be able to count the driver, but you wouldn't be able to count that particular truck. There's some specifics. If you got questions, call the RLPL. They can look and the Merck and some of the specifications for that particular one. Okay, so keep that in mind. Regular dealers. Regular dealers. Uh, Only 60% of what is called regular dealers counts. Now, what do we call regular dealers? That's the word. What do we actually call regular dealers most of the time? Yeah, suppliers. Suppliers of materials and equipment to the project, equipment rental, um, those are only going to count at 60%. And even then, they have to have a place or a storehouse. They're not just a drop shipping kind of thing. That's a broker credit, and you're not going to be able to count most of that. You actually can only count it if they're essentially stockpiling and then delivering it. If they're just drop shipping, you'll only get the broker credit, the cost essentially of transfer, which is pretty small. It's not all the supplies and stuff. Okay. Manufacturers, good news, that's usually 100%. And then service providers, you're going to look at the reasonable fees and commissions. Okay. And that's going to be calculated on a case by case basis. And that's where the drop shipping is going to occur. It's going to be pulled over into the broker credit area. Okay. So again, we'll do another quick case study. DBE fuel supplier firm has a contract to fill gas tanks on site so that on-site equipment can be supplied with fuel. That's actually a pretty cool, useful function. You hire a subcontractor who comes in and they fill up all the fluids every single day. Okay. They've informed you that today They're not going to be trucking the fuel with their own trucks to fill the tanks, but they're renting some tankers to supply for the day. Okay? So what's going to count in this particular case towards the commercially useful function? Cost of the fuel only, cost of the entire operation, broker credit only, or none of the above? A lot of people voted for A in in both ways. But here's the challenge. Let's go back and look at the question again. They're not trucking the fuel with their own trucks. They're renting tankers to drivers to supply the tanks on site. They're more like a supplier, aren't they? And if they're more like a supplier, they're really, at best, they're going to be 60%. But reality is, they're probably going to be broker credit only because those trucks that they're leasing for the day, they don't count. And depending on how where the supplies came from, they may not be able to get the cost of the fuel. They may be considered to just be a broker. They've got to be able to document that they actually stored it and they only had extra trucks to bring it in. A lot of people try to do a cost, but they're going to have to document that material. Otherwise, you have to assume, if you don't have good documentation, that all they're really doing is brokering the material. So be careful of that. Don't just say, let them get away with it. You got to check because if it gets audited and later on it turns out they actually got the fuel from some other place, it wasn't their own fuel storage, you wouldn't be able to count that. So be careful about that. And they may turn into a supplier the minute they do that as well. So be very careful. Okay. Because a regular dealer, remember, only gets 60% credit because they're not doing the actual work. Now, when you put all this paperwork into the EBO, you're going to get flags that show up. You don't need to read any of this. What you need to do is look for the red flags. Okay? If you get a red flag that says there's a late payment owed, don't assume. Don't go, well, they're probably fine. They just haven't put the paperwork in yet. Call them up, ask them, have you gotten paid? Looks like your payment might be late. Don't assume that just because either they don't have a computer or they're behind on their own paperwork. Check. And again, just write a log, write down, hey, it's part of the engineer's work record. Hey, for today, I called up uh, the industry company and I said, did you get paid? And by the way, if they did, then you can document that they got paid. And if they didn't, check with the contractor and figure out what's going on. Okay? Pretty easy to do, pretty important to do. We don't want to mess this up. Okay? The Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, again, this isn't really part of Chapter 15, and yet it is part of Chapter 15 because this is where, uh, we're in construction. Now, when should we really have looked at all of these ADA issues in our process? When should we have really looked at ADA? Yeah, design and probably even scoping. Okay. As a minimum, it should be included in the PS&E, but really want to go all the way back to scoping issues. Do you see a problem in the photograph on screen? Yep, absolutely. No crosswalk. Technically, in New York State, actually, that is a crosswalk. It's one of those weird nuances in New York State because it's at an intersection. But the bigger problem is, where's he going? There's there's no ramp on the other side, no receiving ramp. This can actually create a problem, and it creates it quite often. And that is the scope says we only are working on this side of the roadway. What happens when there's a ramp on, not a ramp on the other side? I always think of it this way when it comes to ADA. Don't get people in trouble. Okay? Yes, that might be outside your scope, but don't assume. And remember, and this is probably the most important thing, ADA does not care the source of funds. It doesn't matter if the funds come from FHWA, New York State DOT, or their own local funds. If you need to follow ADA, you need to follow ADA. So if you're going to be putting a ramp on one side of the street, you may have to put it on the other side. You probably should be doing that as the right thing to do anyway. Okay. When do you have to meet ADA for pavement repairs, for instance? Well, if it's maintenance, you can leave it like it already is. If it's an alteration, you have to upgrade things to meet ADA. This was a decision that was made with a joint agreement between the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Justice Department. They came up with a list of what is maintenance and what is alterations. Now, I will tell you right now, there are people who are very adamantly in disagreement with this list. There are other people who love this list. This is a perfect example of what happens, though, when you get people, when we don't really follow what was the intent of ADA, somebody is going to come along and write a bright line. And whether that's a good bright line or not, now it's a bright line. If you're on the right, you're going to have to put in the ramps. You're going to have to upgrade things to meet ADA, no matter where the funding is coming from. So a cape seal, which is essentially a chip seal and a slurry seal, which are both considered maintenance, now all of a sudden it's listed as an alteration. Now, that theory behind that is anything with more than a little bit of thickness changes the heights, so therefore you got to look at the ADA. But just do me a favor. Try to think about ADA in every single case. It actually is easier. Document what you need to document and move on. And as I said earlier, it really falls all the way back as a minimum in design, but I actually think about it all the way in scoping and sometimes even planning. You may want to look and see, is there really a need for ADA and what is that need? And do me another favor when it comes to ADA. Don't just look at a single group. So when you think ADA or you think disabled or handicapped, whatever word set you use, name some examples of ADA disabilities for me in the Q&A. Give me some examples. Deaf, blind, somebody in a wheelchair, yeah, yeah, vision impaired, sight impairment, elderly, somebody with a cane having a hard time walking is a very serious ADA. Someone who has some kind of disability that is makes them have a hard time documenting things with their brain. That's a mental issue, can be a disability. Yeah. How about color blindness? Does color blindness count? Yeah. Essentially, what we're trying to do is something, the idea is the reasonable solution. And if we don't do the reasonable solution, we get bright lines like that ruling on what's alterations. Try to be reasonable. Give people some reasonable activities, and you're going to be in pretty good shape. Okay. Now, if you're interested a lot more in ADA, we do have a class coming up on ADA issues. It'll be virtual. It's in May. If you're interested, we can get you the detail on it. But essentially, if you think about it, it's really just a matter of doing the right thing for you and your family and trying to do it in the right way early. Okay. I want to spend a little bit of time on uncompleted work agreements. This is 15.4.9. As I said earlier, these you can't have these and have the project closed out. This is a section in there essentially that says we're not done yet. We know that. You need to put these in place so the project doesn't suddenly get stopped and you can't get your funds. So you essentially, as the sponsor, you prepare these uncompleted work agreements with the contractor. Okay. Who else should be involved? See if my computer beats you or if y'all get into the Q&A before the computer wakes up. Yep, there you go. You're just about the same thing. The RLPL. Okay. The idea behind this is you pull some funds out that says there's work that needs to be done. So you pull back some funds to cover the work. And if needed, you extend any insurance, which, by the way, is additional costs. So keep that in mind. The good news is, and that some people go, it's good news? Yeah, it's good news. The closeout won't start. You've got an uncompleted work agreement, so you keep that project active. Okay? So the project won't close out on you. All of a sudden, you can't get your funds. Okay? But remember, if you've got these, you can't close the project out. So be aware of that side of the coin as well. Don't just assume. Okay? If you have to do these, it's really a short term, just keeps things going. And then, of course, there's records retention. Okay, we talked a little bit about this last week, and we'll bring it up again a little bit next week. It's 15.4.10. Okay, so how long do I need to keep records about a project? I've got 7, I've got 10. Most agencies have a record management group. I've got 3. Okay, now when it comes to the paperwork of the project, depends on what kind of paperwork it is. If it's paperwork regarding the contractor and who did what and all that stuff, the requirements say 3 years minimum from the last action. In other words, project's been closed out. 3 years minimum. If it's on the national highway system or state highway, the number jumps up. Okay. Actually, I should just write these down if that's what I was going to do, in fact. Let's see if I've got a pen. That's why I don't have a pen. Duh. So it's 3 years minimum, and my pen is towards noon. I got to reboot. I'm gonna have to remind me next week to reboot before we play Jeopardy, because it's just being persnickety. 3 years minimum, 10 years if it's on the national highway system or a state highway. Okay, that's for the work that's done by the contractor or the subcontractors or things like that. But what about project plans? How long do you keep project plans and as-built? How long do you keep project plans and as-built? Yeah, pretty much forever. Good rule of thumb is you have to keep anything for 3 to 10 years after there's no longer a need to go back and look at the documents. And if it's a structural document or it's a pavement document, you need to keep those forever. So the contract documents, 3 to 10 years, but the actual plans, you need to find a place to keep those for a long time. Okay? So just plan on finding a home for your as-built. Trust me, they're valuable and they can actually save you a lot of work. You may not think people go back to those as-built, but I've seen as-built as far back as the teens when I was working in the county, and they saved our bacon a couple of times. So keep them, okay? So keep going on that. If you're not sure, go a little bit longer. Write right on the forms. I can dispose of this on a particular date. Now, there is an engineering bulletin that came out. Please, I'm just going to tell you right now, don't try to read it. Search for the NYSDOT engineering bulletin. It's a new engineering bulletin that came out, EB 20-029. This is in 2020, last year. So while we're doing COVID, there's still things going on. And it involves anytime you're doing a project where there's state funds, i.e., Marchicelli, other state funds like Bridge New York, because of some tax requirements, federal tax requirements, there's some changes in the way we have to report these things. So now those pieces of paper that deal with those projects that are federal aid and state aid because there's Marchicelli and other state projects. Those have to be kept for 36 years. Okay? 36 years. Okay? So, and that's after final payment. So put them with your as-built and plan on keeping. But again, I really do. Anything that's the paperwork, it's not the structure and stuff like that. Put a date on it so people know, hey, I can dispose of it after a particular date. And question came here: when will the state stop keeping paper records and just transfer it to electronic files? That's a good question. We'll leave that since we have all these Q&As, and I'll throw it into the panel for next week in the pool questions because I don't know the answer to that. They may not either, but we can ask them. I don't mind electronics, but there are some requirements we have to follow. Check with your retentions officer in your municipality and see what you've got there. Okay. Patented or proprietary items. Rules have changed on this, so I just want to make sure we understand this. For projects before 2019, the federal part of 2019, so actually October 28th to be technical about it, okay? FHWA discourages the use of brand or trade names, okay? So you are required for anything that started before that, for projects that were awarded, um, you have to have the use of equal to phrasing. So in other words, you have to say, I want to use this product or an equal, because you're discouraging people trying to use something that is so unique only one person can bid on it or one agency can bid on it. And that's probably not a bad idea. We should be doing that. The idea is inclusion of equivalent materials or products. Now, of course, this does lead to an issue, and that is there are patent and proprietary items out there that are unique and they're protected by patent law. So if you've got something in the process after 2019, October, it's no longer required to have FHWA approving it ahead of time, and it is eligible for federal aid funds. And you no longer have to do special certifications for being an experimental product or something like that. Heck, you can even get premiums and royalties for all of this stuff. Okay? So these are things you're going to be just putting into the contract regulations. Now, is this the best management of funds? Should we look for alternatives? Yes. Much like we do with commercially useful functions or DBE or Buy America, don't jump to proprietary items just because you're allowed to. Go there because it truly is an improvement. Ask yourself later on, if it showed up in the Times Union, would you really be able to justify we went to a patent or to proprietary because it was a better item, because this patent or proprietary item was really better? Or were you going there because you wanted to try to not do something? And would New York State allow this? Yeah, actually it would. It'd be okay. Again, you have to check some specifics, but you have to have a reason behind it. And by the way, you still cannot use from federal aid projects an in-state or local material preference. Okay, you cannot go in there and say we're going to only purchase from in-state materials or only local. Buy America's national, federal aid national. Okay, so you can't do a local, only from this county, only from this New York State for material preferences. Okay. So now we're getting on towards the end. We're in our last 10 minutes for the day. Okay. So we're going to start with our acronym minefield. Okay. So I'm going to purposely do this. Let me find there it is, and bring this down. Okay. And again, has all kind of resources and links for us. Someone puts in the Q&A, I doubt general municipal law would ever allow this in terms of proprietary. It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, whether general municipal law will allow it or not. I honestly don't know. I do know federal law allows it, um, but I don't know for sure. I'd have to get a lawyer in that particular case. My gut instinct is if you could justify it, you probably could, but you'd have to be able to justify it, and I don't know. We'll add it to the pile for the poll for the panel. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just a couple of minutes, real briefly, on 3 or 4 of my favorite acronyms. Okay, so let's see, what acronyms are we going to do now? How about, I've said this one quite often today, but we've already done the CUF, commercially useful function. What is GFE? Good faith effort. Yep. And by the way, the other note person says GML does allow justification. That's the key. If you're going to use patent or proprietary, you have to have justification on why. You can't just do it because you want to. Let's pick another one. MUARK. Merck. MUA. Manual of Uniform Record Keeping. Very good. Okay. Y'all are good on that one. That was good. PLAFAP. That's a challenging one. And I'll give you credit if you tell me its current name. PLAFAP. This one right here. Local Projects Manual. Yes, people got it. Procedures for locally administered federal aid projects. Yeah, it's been changed. It's now called the Local Projects Manual. It's a lot easier to remember. Okay, good. Okay. So let me minimize this. We'll come back over here. I'm I'm not opposed to acronyms. I love acronyms. They're sort of fun, but we do have to be careful with jargon. And remember, if you're talking to uh, the public, try not to use those acronyms too much. In fact, I got one more acronym that I want to make sure I don't forget about. RLO. RLO. Who's the RLO? RLO. I know this comes from last week and we're making you stretch your brain back, but what is the RLO? The responsible local official. This is the person who's actually signing off that the project that you're doing what you're going to do. The project manager certifies everything, but gives it to the responsible local official who signs off. So for a village, who is that likely to be in a village? Who is the responsible local official in a village? The mayor. Yeah. So if you're using jargon with the mayor, you may lose them immediately. Try to use language and explain the jargon to them to make sure you don't lose them. You don't want to do that. That's not fair to them. It's not fair to you. Okay. So got a couple of last things we're going to do, but day 3 next week, we are going to be the construction monitoring and closeout. We are going to be doing a Q&A. We've already got a bunch of questions, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to put more questions in here in just a minute. I do also want 4 volunteers who want to play along with our little Jeopardy game. Everybody will get to play, but we're going to try tracking 4 people just to have a little bit of fun with it. I haven't figured out the prize yet, but we'll do something. The people on the panel currently are listed here, okay? But what I want to do is I want to give everybody an opportunity to put in other questions, okay? I've already got one here, okay? So you're going to spend a couple of minutes here. I want you to put those in. I'll answer them as they come across if I know them, okay? So, how can DB requirements be recognized to industry? Can federal fund deadlines be extended? Again, you'd have to have part of the SLA in that case. So put your answers, your questions in here, okay? And some of these, like the one on do we need a final agreement with the contractor or final pay estimate, we're going to talk about those next week as we close things out, Can you ask for additional funds if the state local agreement comes in high? Great question. I bet y'all know the answer to that. We're not going to, I'm not sure we're going to put that on Facebook, the videos. I got to be careful again, dealing with fair use. I'd have to go back and check and see what we can post and what we can't. So we may not be able to post a copy of this particular one. Um, and can we have a workshop on consultant procurement admin? Like all of you, as I said earlier, what's the hardest thing to work on? What's the one thing I don't have enough of? What do you think? What's the one thing we don't have enough of ever? Time. Yeah, time. None of us have enough time. So we have to balance those things. So I'm going to leave this up for about another minute. You probably didn't realize it. I stole some time from you. I took 2 minutes from you doing your last break. So we're going to end a couple of minutes early and go from there. But I am going to leave this up. I want you to keep putting in your questions for next week. We were going to summarize them. We will send this out to the panel ahead of time so the panel won't get hit with them blind, though you're welcome to add additional questions. No questions asked, quote unquote, Nick Wink. And again, if you want to send one in later on, please feel free. Won't bother me in the slightest because I'd rather get good questions and answer your questions as much as possible. Okay? And then once my computer decides to wake up, there's an email address. You can send it directly to me if you have a question, which is david.orr, or you can send it just to the overall program one, which is CLRP, both at cornell.edu. Or go to our website, NYSLTAP.CALS.cornell.edu. And with that, uh, we are at our 11:58 because I stole the 2 minutes from you. I'm giving them back to you. So you got your 3 hours of contact time. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask us. And otherwise, we will see you next week. And I'm still looking for volunteers. So let me know. Take care and have a safe day. Bye bye. Yep. You want to put it in the Q&A? You'll volunteer for the Jeopardy. Well, we have the Q&A. We can get your name. And I can send you instructions ahead of time.